Each testimony builds a stronger case. Every sharp focus reveals clarity. Learning your legal rights, upholding unyielding justice.
Hey, whoa, take your business elsewhere. Get out of my restaurant right now. Don't sit here eating our food while you harass my staff. Out, pay your bill.
The confrontation happened at 10:45 a.m. on a busy Saturday morning in the dining room of Quick Eats restaurant in Minnesota. What started as 3 off-duty ICE.
It was 12:34 p.m. on a Friday when cell phone cameras from at least 4 customers captured something that would go viral within hours and transform a small family diner in Phoenix, Arizona into the center of national debate about power, dignity, and where the line between federal authority and abuse begins. A middle-aged white woman in a green apron, order notebook in hand, was pointing directly at 2 ICE agents in tactical vests sitting in a window booth and telling them to leave her restaurant. The agents who had just been eating looked at her with a mixture of surprise and arrogance, apparently unable to process that someone was actually asking them to leave. The entire restaurant had stopped. Servers stopped serving. Cooks came out of the kitchen. Other customers, some filming, all watching, were witnessing something that rarely happened in public. Someone with less institutional power looking directly at armed federal agents and saying no. What had led to this moment started 32 minutes earlier when a young black waitress named Keisha Williams had approached those same agents' table to take their order, and one of them had decided that a federal vest gave him the right to put her through something no employee should have to endure to earn her paycheck. And the manager now expelling those agents, Sandra Kowalski, had spent 17 years building a reputation for a restaurant where every employee was treated with dignity. She wasn't about to let that reputation be destroyed by 2 men who confused a tactical vest with permission to treat people as less than human. Before we dive into this completely extraordinary story, tell me something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, hit that subscribe button now, because stories like this need to be shared, need to be remembered, need to inspire other people to do the same when the time comes. You won't want to miss a single second of what happens next. Kowalski's Diner had existed for 23 years on the same corner of Camelback Road in Phoenix. It was the type of restaurant that cities needed but rarely managed to keep. Affordable prices, genuinely homemade food, service that made you feel welcome regardless of who you were or how much money you had. Sandra Kowalski had inherited the establishment from her father at 35 when he became ill, and had transformed a modest operation into a community institution serving 600 to 800 people per day for breakfast and lunch. She had built a team that was more like family. Cooks who had been there for over a decade, waitresses who had worked at the restaurant while going through college, dishwashers she had helped obtain legal documentation. She paid above minimum wage, offered flexible schedules for parents of young children, and had an explicit zero-tolerance policy for customers who disrespected employees. That policy had cost some customers over the years. Sandra had never regretted any of them. Keisha Williams was 24 years old and had started working at Kowalski's 18 months earlier while completing her business administration's degree at Arizona State University. She was exactly the type of employee Sandra loved hiring: smart, reliable, genuinely good with customers, capable of handling chaotic lunch rushes without losing composure or smile. She had quickly become one of the restaurant's most popular waitresses, with regular customers specifically requesting to sit in her section. On that Friday, Keisha had arrived for the lunch shift at 11 a.m., picked up her usual section of 6 tables, including 3 window booths, and begun what promised to be a normal busy day. At 12:02 p.m., 2 men in ICE vests and tactical clothing entered the restaurant and were directed by the hostess to a window booth in Keisha's section. She had noticed the ICE vests but hadn't paid special attention. She served everyone. Equally, it was simply how she worked. The agents, who would later be identified as Victor Santos and Craig Henderson, sat down and began reviewing menus. Keisha approached within 2 minutes with water and bread, as she did with all tables, and asked if they were ready to order or needed more time. Santos looked at her for a moment with an expression other waitresses who were observing would later describe as deliberately intimidating, then asked where she was from. Keisha said she was from Phoenix. Santos said she didn't look like she was from here. Keisha politely said she had been born at Banner University Medical Center 5 blocks away. Santos said he was asking about her family, where her family was originally from. Keisha, whose grandparents had come to Arizona from Mississippi in the 1950s, said her family was from Arizona and the American South. Santos said she had the look of someone who might not have documentation. Henderson said nothing, but the video captured him, looking at Keisha with an expression of amusement as his partner interrogated her. The implication of what Santos had said took a second for Keisha to process. Then it became completely clear. Santos had looked at a young black American woman serving water in a family restaurant and decided, based on nothing but her appearance, that she was probably an undocumented immigrant. There was nothing in Keisha's behavior, nothing in her speech, nothing in any interaction that had provided any basis for that assumption. She had spoken fluent, unaccented English from the moment she opened her mouth. She had mentioned being born at a specific hospital in Phoenix. She had said her family was from Mississippi and Arizona. There was absolutely nothing that justified the assumption Santos had made beyond Keisha being a black woman in a state with documented history of ICE agents making assumptions about who looked like an immigrant. Keisha calmly said she was an American citizen, had been born in the United States, and asked what they would like to order. Santos said he would need to see identification before she continued serving them. Henderson finally spoke, saying it was standard procedure when there was suspicion of irregular immigration status. Keisha stood still for a moment. She was 24 years old, was at work, wearing a family restaurant uniform in a state where she had lived her entire life, and a federal agent had just said he suspected she was an illegal immigrant based on how she looked. She could have argued, could have confronted. Instead, she said she would be back in a moment and walked to the employee area at the back of the restaurant. Another waitress, Maria Delgado, noticed the expression on Keisha's face and followed her. She found Keisha in the employee bathroom, crying. Not angry crying, the crying of exhaustion of being a young black American woman who had spent her entire life proving she belonged in spaces she had never needed to prove. And yet here, she was at her job, being asked for identification by a government agent because her appearance had led someone to assume she wasn't from here. Maria stayed with Keisha for a minute, then went directly to find Sandra. Sandra was in the back office reviewing supplier orders when Maria came in with an expression Sandra had learned over 17 years of management to immediately recognize. Something had happened to one of her employees, and it wasn't small. Maria explained what she had seen and heard. Sandra was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, then put the clipboard on the desk, took her apron off the hook on the wall, put it on, grabbed her order notebook because she had been a manager long enough to know that documented details mattered, and walked to the front of the restaurant with the stride of someone who had made a decision and there was nothing left to decide. Sandra arrived at the window booth where Santos and Henderson were sitting with an expression that employees who had known her for years later described as the calmest and at the same time most determined they had ever seen on her. She didn't raise her voice, didn't gesture dramatically. She simply stood beside the table, looked directly at Santos, and said she had heard what had happened with her employee and needed to understand what they thought they were doing. Santos said they were just asking routine questions. Sandra asked what specific routine authorized federal agents to demand identification from an American waitress in a private restaurant without any specific cause beyond how she looked. Santos said they had authority to verify immigration status of anyone who raised suspicion. Sandra said Keisha had raised suspicion simply by being black and serving tables in Arizona, and wanted to know if Santos was comfortable saying that out loud in a restaurant full of customers who were clearly hearing every word. Santos was quiet for a moment. Henderson looked out the window. Their silence was all the answer that needed to be said. Sandra hadn't arrived at those agents' booth without having made a quick and precise calculation about exactly what she could and couldn't do. She had managed a restaurant for 17 years, in a state with an intensely politicized immigration environment, had navigated health inspections, labor audits, and difficult customers of every kind. She knew the difference between legitimate federal authority and overreach. ICE agents had authority to conduct immigration operations, but that authority had clearly defined limits by law and judicial precedent. They could enter public establishments like any citizen. But demanding a restaurant employee prove citizenship based solely on racial appearance, without a warrant, without specific articulable cause, without any factual basis beyond how someone looked, was an exercise of legitimate federal authority. It was harassment. And on private property, the owner had the right to protect employees from harassment regardless of who was doing the harassing. Santos tried to reassert authority, saying they were in a public establishment and had the right to ask questions. Sandra said her restaurant was private property open to the public, a legal distinction that mattered enormously, and that as owner and manager, she had a legal obligation to provide a harassment-free work environment for her employees. She said what Santos had done to Keisha, asking where she was from, saying she didn't look like she was from here, and then demanding identification based on racial appearance, constituted harassment based on race and national origin, protected by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. She said she had a lawyer on retainer who knew employment and civil rights law, that she had documented what had happened, and that she hoped they understood they had crossed a line in her establishment. Santos looked at Henderson, clearly not expecting a diner manager to be able to cite specific civil rights legislation. Henderson said they thought they had simply asked routine questions, and if there had been a misunderstanding, they were sorry. Sandra said there was no misunderstanding. There was a 24-year-old employee in the bathroom crying because a federal agent had assumed she was an illegal immigrant based on how she looked. Customer cell phone cameras had been recording for at least 2 minutes at this point. Nobody in the room was pretending not to hear. A family of 4 in the adjacent booth had stopped eating completely. An elderly man, alone near the counter, had turned his chair for a better view. 2 businessmen in suits near the entrance had put their phones on the table and were watching attentively. There was something in the absolute moral clarity of what Sandra was doing, and the composure with which she was doing it, that had captured every person's attention in the restaurant. She wasn't being dramatic, wasn't being aggressive. She was being precise and unwavering, saying exactly what needed to be said without an extra word and without backing down an inch. That kind of moral clarity was rare to see in action, and everyone in the restaurant recognized it when they saw it. Sandra told Santos and Henderson they were welcome to finish the food they had ordered because she wasn't going to let them leave without paying, but that after doing so, she expected them to leave and not return to her establishment. She said if they wanted to eat there again in the future, they would be welcome like any other customer, but any attempt to question employees about immigration, status based on appearance, would be treated as the harassment it was. Santos said they were just doing their job. Sandra said their job didn't include making young Americans cry in employee bathrooms for the crime of being black in Arizona. She turned, went to the register, and personally processed their bill, ensuring the amount was correct to the cent, because she didn't want to give them any additional reason to stay or return. Customers at nearby tables started applauding. Not a huge ovation, but steady and genuine, some customers standing. Santos and Henderson ate the rest of their meal in tense silence, paid, and left without further words. Maria Delgado had returned to the employee bathroom during Sandra's confrontation with the agents to stay with Keisha. She later described being able to hear parts of the exchange through the door, and having told Keisha what was happening as it happened. Keisha had come out of the bathroom when she heard applause begin, not knowing exactly what had caused it. She had walked into the restaurant to see Santos and Henderson walking toward the exit, and Sandra standing near the register with the expression of someone who had done exactly what needed to be done. Keisha had asked what happened. Sandra had said simply that she had asked them to leave. Keisha had looked at Sandra for a moment, then said, "Thank you," in a voice so low that Sandra said she had barely heard it over the restaurant noise that had returned to normal volume. Sandra had said there was nothing to thank her for, that it was exactly what any employer should do, and asked Keisha if she was well enough to continue her shift or needed to go home. Keisha had stayed. She had said she wanted to stay, that going home would have felt like letting something win that didn't deserve to win. She had washed her face, straightened her uniform, and returned to her section with the same professionalism she had demonstrated all morning. Customers who had watched the entire exchange treated her with additional solicitude for the rest of the shift, several leaving tips significantly larger than normal, some stopping to say words of support when leaving. An older woman had taken Keisha's hand and said what Sandra had done was what all employers should do, and that she was clearly an extraordinary employee at an extraordinary restaurant. Keisha had thanked her with a smile that, according to Maria, who was watching, looked genuine for the first time since the agents had entered. Nobody in the restaurant had filmed intentionally to create viral content. The 4 customers who had recorded had done so by instinct, sensing they were witnessing something significant that should be documented. But when those videos hit social media throughout that afternoon, the world watched. The first video was posted at 2:17 p.m. by a customer named David Park, a 41-year-old accountant who had been eating lunch alone near the window booth. He had written a simple caption: "Restaurant manager in Phoenix tells ICE agents to leave after they harassed black waitress." In 3 hours, it had 2 million views. By evening, it had 50 million. By the next day, it had crossed 100 million. Not because there was violence, not because there was dramatic confrontation, but because there was something powerful and rare in what the video showed. An ordinary person with less institutional power than those she was confronting doing the right thing in a calm, precise, and absolutely unwavering way. Sandra was at home when she began to realize the magnitude of what was happening. Her 20-year-old daughter had called saying the restaurant video was everywhere. Sandra had checked her phone and found 847 notifications on the restaurant's social media account that normally received maybe 5 per day. Messages were coming in from across the country, from people who had seen the video and wanted to say what she had done mattered. She had sat at the kitchen table for a long moment, reading messages, thinking about Keisha in the bathroom, crying, thinking about the 17 years it had taken to build that restaurant into a place where every employee knew they were protected. She hadn't expelled those agents to go viral. She had done it because she was the manager, and those were her employees, and none of them should have to endure that to earn a paycheck. But if the fact that she had done it inspired others to do the same, then there was something good coming out of something that had started as something very, very bad. The morning after the incident brought a completely different reality to Kowalski's Diner. Sandra had arrived at 5:30 a.m., as always, to prepare for opening, and found something she had never seen in the restaurant's 23 years of existence: a line of people waiting outside before it even opened. It wasn't a small line. There were 72 people waiting when she unlocked the door at 6 a.m., some who had clearly arrived well before opening time, some carrying handwritten signs saying things like, "Kowalski's, where everyone is welcome," and "Sandra Kowalski, Phoenix Hero." Sandra had stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at those people, feeling the weight of what had overnight become something much larger than her or her restaurant. She had taken a deep breath, opened the door fully, and said the coffee was fresh, and there was a table for everyone. The restaurant stayed at maximum capacity all day, with a line outside that never completely diminished. They served over 1,200 people that Saturday, nearly double their previous record. Keisha had arrived for her shift that Saturday and frozen when she saw the line. Sandra had found her in the parking lot and explained what was happening. Keisha had looked at the line for a long moment, then said something Sandra would repeat in multiple interviews in the months that followed. Keisha had said she had spent her life being invisible in the wrong places and visible in the wrong places too, and that she didn't know exactly what to do with being visible this way, the right way. Sandra had said she didn't need to do anything beyond what she always did, that she was excellent at her job, and those people had come because they wanted to support a place that treated employees with dignity, not to see Keisha as spectacle. That distinction had mattered to Keisha. She had gone in, put on her apron, and worked the shift with the same grace and professionalism that had characterized every previous shift, though that day many customers had recognized her and stopped to say words of support she had received with a genuine smile and sincere thank you. Media coverage exploded throughout the weekend. Virtually every major national news outlet had covered the story by Sunday. The angle varied. Some focused on Sandra as unlikely hero, diner manager who had faced armed federal agents with nothing but knowledge of law and moral determination. Others focused on Keisha as representation of the broader experience of Black Americans being presumed foreigners in a country where their families had lived for generations. Still others focused on broader legal questions about ICE authority on private property and legal limits of immigration status checks without specific cause. Law professors at universities being consulted explained that what Santos had done in demanding identification from Keisha based on racial appearance without any other specific cause was in deeply problematic legal territory, potentially, constituting violation of Fourth Amendment protection against detention without reasonable cause and 14th Amendment discrimination based on race. ICE's response was revealing in its inadequacy. A spokesperson issued a statement saying the agency took misconduct allegations seriously and that the incident was being reviewed internally. There was no acknowledgement that something had gone wrong, no apology to Keisha, no commitment to specific action. It was generic corporate language designed to sound responsive without committing to anything concrete. The statement was widely ridiculed online as exactly the kind of non-responsive response that allowed a culture of impunity to flourish within law enforcement agencies. Members of Congress from both parties, though for different reasons, called for explanations. Senators who were critics of ICE used the incident as evidence of need for stricter oversight. Senators who generally supported aggressive immigration enforcement distanced themselves from the specific incident, saying, if the facts were as reported, then it had been clear misconduct. ICE's internal investigation was formally opened Monday after the incident, but what had begun as an internal review quickly expanded when civil rights organizations began presenting evidence that the incident with Keisha wasn't isolated. The American Civil Liberties Union had tracked 34 similar incidents in the past 2 years in Arizona and neighboring states where employees of restaurants, stores, and other commercial establishments had been questioned about immigration status based on racial appearance. In 31 of the 34 cases, employees questioned were people of color, predominantly Black and Latino. In 28 cases, employees were native-born American citizens. In no case had there been any specific cause beyond appearance for questioning. The data painted a picture of a systematic pattern of racial profiling being used by ICE agents in Arizona well beyond the Keisha incident. A pattern that had been happening without accountability because previous victims hadn't had a Sandra Kowalski to publicly defend them. Lawyers specializing in employment rights and immigration proactively contacted Sandra offering pro bono representation for any legal action she or Keisha wanted to take. Civil rights organizations offered resources and support. The ACLU requested a meeting with Sandra and Keisha to discuss the broader case. Sandra, who had consulted her retainer lawyer immediately after the incident, had meticulously documented everything: precise timeline of events, written statements from Maria Delgado, and 3 other employees who had witnessed the interaction, names of customers who had watched and potentially filmed, and crucially, had preserved footage from the restaurant's internal security cameras that had captured everything from a different angle than the cell phone videos that had gone viral. Those security cameras showed what cell phone videos didn't clearly show: the expression on Santos' face when he had first looked at Keisha, the exact moment when he had decided to question her, and the complete absence of any behavior on Keisha's part that could have justified legitimate suspicion. Keisha had made a difficult decision about how to respond to public attention. She had received dozens of interview requests from outlets across the country. Her first instinct had been to refuse everything, preserve privacy, not become the face of something that had made her feel victimized rather than empowered. But after talking with family, with Sandra, and with a civil rights attorney she had contacted, she had arrived at a different perspective. She had said in her first interview with a reporter from the Arizona Republic that she had initially wanted to disappear from all the attention because the incident had been humiliating and re-traumatizing in ways that people who had never experienced it would have difficulty understanding. But she had realized staying silent would allow the narrative of the incident to be told by others rather than by her. There were 34 other similar cases, and those victims had no platform. If she spoke not just for herself. The Arizona Republic interview was published Thursday, 6 days after the incident. Keisha had spoken with clarity and precision about what she had felt when Santos had asked where she was from, what had gone through her mind when he had said she had the look of someone without documentation, the familiar exhaustion of having to prove she belonged in spaces in her own country. She had spoken about growing up in Phoenix as daughter and granddaughter of Arizonans, about studying at ASU, about plans to open her own business after graduation, about how no amount of education or achievement seemed to guarantee complete protection against assumptions people made based on appearance. She had spoken about Sandra not as hero but as employer who had done what all employers should do, and rarely did: defend an employee when the employee couldn't defend herself without potentially higher personal cost. The interview had been read over 2 million times online in the first 24 hours. Sandra had given her own interview the same day to USA Today. She had said something reporters had reproduced in countless subsequent articles about the case. When asked what she had been thinking when she had walked toward those agents' booth, Sandra had said she hadn't been thinking about consequences, hadn't been thinking about going viral, hadn't been thinking about anything except that one of her employees was crying in the bathroom and she was the person responsible for that establishment. And there was one simple thing that needed to be done. She had said managers who needed to think very hard about whether to defend employees when employees were being harassed probably shouldn't be managers. That statement, simple and direct like Sandra herself, had become one of the most shared of the entire case coverage. The ICE internal investigation expanded rapidly when investigators began reviewing Santos and Henderson's complete histories. What they found was disturbing in its consistency. Santos had accumulated 7 formal complaints in his 8 years as an agent, 5 of them involving allegations that he had approached people of color in private commercial establishments without specific cause beyond appearance. In each previous case, internal investigations had concluded Santos had exercised reasonable judgment based on experiential indicators, a phrase external investigators now interpreted as administrative cover for systematic racial profiling. Henderson had a less extensive but equally concerning history. 4 complaints in 6 years, 3 involving approaches to employees of color on private property. In both cases, the pattern was unmistakable. They consistently targeted non-white people in spaces where white people doing identical activities were left completely alone. The question the investigation faced wasn't whether racial profiling had occurred. It was why it had occurred dozens of times without resulting in serious consequence for either agent. The answer to that question emerged through supervisor depositions. Santos and Henderson's immediate supervisor, Special Agent in Charge Richard Porter, had been aware of multiple complaints against both agents but had systematically minimized each one. His management philosophy, which became clear through internal emails discovered during investigation, was that aggressive agents produced more detentions, and more detentions was how success was measured and rewarded within his division. Porter had implemented an informal metric system where agents with higher numbers of investigative contacts received more favorable performance evaluations, without distinction about whether those contacts had been based on legitimate suspicion or racial profiling. Santos had consistently had some of the highest numbers in the division. Those numbers had been treated as evidence of diligence rather than as warning signs of problematic behavior. Porter had created an environment where agents knew aggressive results were rewarded, and that complaints from people who were targets of that aggressiveness would be treated as bureaucratic noise rather than legitimate feedback. Santos's depositions during investigation were revealing in ways his lawyers clearly hadn't anticipated. When asked directly what had specifically led him to suspect Keisha, Santos initially tried the familiar argument that he had experience recognizing people who were nervous or avoiding eye contact. Investigators showed him restaurant security footage from the 2 minutes before Santos approached Keisha, which showed her walking toward their table with a professional smile, making normal eye contact, behaving exactly like a waitress going to take an order. There was no sign of nervousness or avoidance behavior. Santos then tried to say something about the general context had drawn his attention. Investigators asked what specifically in the context had been different for Keisha's table versus other tables in the same restaurant. Santos couldn't identify anything specific. When investigators showed footage of white waitresses serving nearby tables in the same circumstances without being approached by Santos, he was silent for a long moment before saying he had exercised judgment based on experience. Investigators asked in what part of his experience he had learned that being black and serving tables in Arizona was an indicator of possible irregular immigration status. Santos couldn't answer. Henderson had tried a different strategy, arguing that Santos had been the one who initiated questioning and that he had merely supported his partner as protocol required. But footage showed Henderson making eye contact with Santos in a way that multiple customer testimonies described as encouraging when Santos had made the first comment about Keisha's appearance. And the expression of amusement multiple witnesses had described seeing on Henderson's face while Santos interrogated Keisha was clearly captured on the restaurant's internal security cameras Sandra had preserved. Henderson hadn't merely followed his partner out of professional duty. He had watched a young woman being humiliated and had considered it entertainment. That moral distinction mattered enormously, both in terms of individual culpability and in terms of what it revealed about the culture within their division. Porter, the supervisor, faced even more severe questioning. Investigators presented him with Santos's complete stop data over 8 years, showing that 89% of all his investigative contacts at private establishments had involved people of color, despite Arizona being a state where people of color constituted approximately 42% of the population. The numbers were mathematically impossible to attribute to coincidence or to legitimate crime patterns. When investigators asked Porter how he had interpreted that data over the years, he said he had seen Santos as a particularly effective agent working in areas with high concentration of irregular immigration activity. Investigators asked how he had determined which areas had high concentration of irregular immigration activity. Porter paused a long time before admitting it was based primarily on the agent's own reports about where they were conducting contacts. The circle was complete and perfect in its circularity. Agents targeted certain areas based on prejudice, reported those areas as having high activity. Supervisors sent them back to those same areas based on those reports, and the cycle continued indefinitely without any external verification. The civil lawsuit was filed by Keisha and Kowalski's restaurant 3 weeks after the incident. The petition was elegant in its precision. For Keisha personally, it argued violation of Fourth Amendment, protection against detention without reasonable cause, 14th Amendment discrimination based on race and national origin, and violation of federal civil rights statutes prohibiting discrimination based on race in public accommodations. For the restaurant, it argued interference with employment relationship, creating a hostile work environment through governmental action, and violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, protecting employees from race-based harassment in the workplace regardless of the conduct's origin. The lawsuit named Santos and Henderson personally, Porter as negligent supervisor, ICE as agency, and the Department of Homeland Security. Damages sought reflected not only individual suffering, but measurable economic costs, emotional impact on Keisha, potential damage to her professional reputation, and costs Kowalski's had incurred, responding to the incident, including management time and legal consultation. The government tried to argue qualified immunity for Santos, and Henderson, arguing that the law about when agents could request identification from employees of private establishments wasn't clearly established in a way reasonable agents should have known. Federal Judge Miriam Chen, assigned to the case, rejected the argument in a decision widely praised by legal experts as a model of clear reasoning about qualified immunity. Judge Chen wrote that an American citizen's right not to be detained and interrogated about immigration status based solely on racial appearance had been established by sufficiently clear precedent that any reasonable agent should have known Santos's conduct violated a clearly established right. She pointed out that even if there were ambiguity about specific immigration law, anti-discrimination law clearly established that differential treatment based on race was unconstitutional in virtually any context. Demanding identification from a black employee while not doing the same for white colleagues in identical circumstances was racial discrimination so direct that qualified immunity simply didn't apply. The lawsuit's discovery revealed documents that made the government's position increasingly untenable. There was an ICE training manual that explicitly specified that racial appearance alone was never sufficient basis for approaching someone for immigration status verification, that agents needed specific articulable cause based on observed behavior rather than physical characteristics. Santos had completed training using that manual, had signed a document acknowledging he had understood the principles, had then systematically violated those principles in 17 documented contacts over 8 years without serious consequences. Discovery showed the problem wasn't lack of training on correct rules. It was that the system had sent a message through rewards and consequences that the rules didn't need to be followed when they resulted in lower numbers. Santos had learned that the manual said one thing and that rewarded practice said something completely different. Porter had created an environment where rewarded practice was what mattered, and the manual was a technicality experienced agents learned to ignore. While the lawsuit advanced, something unexpected had begun happening at the restaurant. Kowalski's had become a destination. Not a tourist destination in the conventional sense, but a place people traveled specifically to visit because what had happened there had resonated with experiences they had had or witnessed. Sandra began receiving letters from business owners across the country, asking how she had had the clarity to act the way she had, asking for advice on how to build similar employee protection policies. She had answered every letter personally because she considered genuine questions deserving genuine answers. She had consistently said the same thing. There was no secret, no special policy. There was only a clear decision that no employee should ever have, to stand alone when being treated in a way that violated their dignity. That decision, made 17 years earlier when she had taken over her father's restaurant, had been the only preparation she had needed that Friday. 7 months after the incident, settlement negotiations entered their final phase, with the government making an offer that reflected both the overwhelming strength of evidence and the political and public pressure the case had generated. The direct compensation offer was $1.4 million specifically for Keisha, a number her lawyers described as recognition of constitutional rights violation, documented emotional suffering, and potential long-term impact on the career trajectory of a young woman who had been presumed an illegal immigrant at her own job. Kowalski's would receive separate compensation of $340,000 for interference with employment relations and costs incurred responding to the incident. But, as in all cases of this nature that Sandra and Keisha's lawyers had carefully studied, financial compensation was only the minor part of what mattered. The systemic reforms were where the settlement would find its true and lasting legacy. Santos would be permanently fired with federal law enforcement certification revoked, making any future employment in any law enforcement capacity at any federal or state agency impossible. Henderson would receive equally permanent termination, with the same certification consequences. Porter, the supervisor who had created a metric system that had rewarded discriminatory behavior over years, would be forced into early retirement with substantial loss of benefits and a permanent note in his file documenting supervisory failure that had contributed to systematic violation of civil rights of multiple American citizens over 8 years. His prospects for any future employment in law enforcement supervision were effectively zero. The settlement also required the specific ICE division in Arizona to undergo comprehensive external audit of all investigative contacts from the past 3 years, with public data on racial disparities and who had been approached and why. The training reform was comprehensive in ways that went well beyond what Sandra or Keisha had initially hoped to achieve. ICE would be required to develop a new specific training module on operations in private property, with particular focus on constitutional limits of immigration status checks and absolute prohibition on using racial appearance as a basis for suspicion. Critical was that training would be developed in collaboration with external civil rights organizations outside ICE, not by internal personnel who had demonstrated capacity to create manuals with correct rules while simultaneously rewarding violation of those rules. Training would include a case study based specifically on the Kowalski's incident, with all details of how Santos had targeted Keisha and how Judge Chen had analyzed the violation, making it impossible for future agents to claim they didn't understand why that type of behavior was illegal and unacceptable. The new performance metric system was perhaps the most transformative reform component. Thus, the settlement required complete elimination of any performance evaluation system that rewarded gross volume of investigative contacts without waiting for the quality and legality of those contacts. The replacement system would evaluate agents on multiple dimensions, including compliance with constitutional protocols, quality of submitted reports, feedback from supervisors who had observed contacts, and absence of sustained complaints. Agents with histories of similar complaints would no longer be automatically promoted, as Santos had been throughout his career, despite accumulating complaints. The system would be audited externally by an independent panel annually, with results published publicly to create transparency that had been completely absent. The central idea was simple but revolutionary within the ICE culture Porter had cultivated. Number of detentions wasn't a measure of success if those detentions were achieved through violation of constitutional rights. Keisha was consulted on every component of the settlement by her lawyers before accepting. She had spent weeks thinking about what she wanted the outcome to be, talking with family, with professors at ASU who mentored her, with Sandra, who had become a mentor figure in her life, in a way neither of them had planned when Keisha had shown up for a job interview 18 months earlier. Keisha had developed a clear vision of what the settlement needed to achieve, to be worth accepting, rather than going to trial. It needed to remove Santos and Henderson from positions where they could harm others. It needed to hold Porter accountable for creating the environment that had enabled their behavior. It needed to change the training system in a way that prevented future agents from learning that racial profiling was acceptable practice. And it needed to create transparency through public data that made discriminatory patterns visible rather than hidden in internal reports supervisors like Porter could ignore indefinitely. When her lawyers confirmed the settlement met each of those criteria, Keisha said she was ready to sign. Sandra had made a separate but related decision about what to do with the restaurant's compensation. She had consulted with accountant, with lawyer, and with staff, and had reached the conclusion that the money belonged to the community that had supported the restaurant so extraordinarily after the incident. She established the Kowalski's Employee Defense Fund, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing resources for low-income employees experiencing harassment or workplace discrimination who couldn't afford lawyers. The fund would provide free legal consultation, documentation support for employees wanting to file formal complaints, and in deserving cases, direct legal representation. Sandra had seen how many of the 34 victims of similar incidents the ACLU had documented had never received any accountability because they simply hadn't had resources to fight back. The fund would try to change that calculation, making legal protection less a function of who you knew or how much money you had. The press conference announcing the settlement happened at Kowalski's Diner, a deliberate decision by Sandra, who had said she wanted the place where it occurred to be the place where accountability was announced. She had closed the restaurant to customers that morning, but had invited full staff to be present, every waitress, every cook, every dishwasher who had been there that Friday, or heard about what had happened. They were present when Keisha and Sandra positioned themselves before cameras with lawyers and representatives from civil rights organizations that had supported the case. Keisha spoke first. She said that when she had gone into the employee bathroom that Friday, she had felt as if the world had confirmed something she had been taught to fear, but never accept. That regardless of what she achieved, regardless of where she was born or grew, there were people with authority who would always see her first as a threat to be verified, rather than a person to be respected. She said she had spent hours in that bathroom thinking about what she had done wrong to deserve that. And the answer had been nothing. Absolutely nothing. Keisha then said something that had silenced the room completely. She said that when she had come out of the bathroom and seen Sandra walking toward that booth with that expression of absolute determination, she had felt something she hadn't felt very often in that specific context. She had felt that someone in a position of power had chosen to use that power to protect her rather than ignore what was happening because it was more convenient. She said that feeling, as simple and direct as it was, had been profoundly powerful, not because it was extraordinary that someone defended her, but because it had been rare enough that when it happened, it had felt extraordinary. And that rarity, that surprise of being defended when it should be basic expectation, was the real problem she hoped the settlement and reforms would begin to address. Sandra spoke afterward, more briefly. She said Kowalski's had been built on a simple premise, that every person who walked through the door, whether customer or employee, deserved to be treated with complete dignity. She said she had done nothing on Friday beyond applying that premise, and that it had been simultaneously gratifying and disturbing that applying such a basic premise had generated so much. Gratifying because it showed people wanted to see dignity defended. Disturbing because it showed how rarely it happened, that when it did, it became national news. She had looked at her employees gathered in the room and said each of them deserved an employer willing to do what she had done, and hoped the settlement and attention it had generated would make that standard more common rather than exceptional. She then reopened the restaurant at noon, and there was a line beginning to form before the doors even opened. The settlement terms were implemented with unusual speed for federal processes, reflecting the continued public pressure and oversight civil rights organizations had promised to apply. Santos and Henderson were fired within 10 days of signing, their certifications immediately revoked by the Federal Training and Standards Council. Santos had tried to argue through the union that his termination was disproportionate for what he characterized as an isolated incident of questionable judgment. The arbitrator who reviewed the case rejected the argument categorically, pointing out that 7 previous complaints with identical pattern of behavior made it impossible to characterize the Kowalski's incident as isolated. It was the conclusion of a pattern, not the beginning of one. Santos had received multiple opportunities over 8 years to correct his behavior and had chosen not to because the system under Porter had made that choice consequence-free. The termination was a belated consequence that should have arrived years earlier. Henderson tried a similar appeal and received a similar result. Both left ICE without realistic prospects of return to any law enforcement work. Porter had resisted more vigorously, hiring a lawyer specializing in the federal labor litigation and arguing that his forced retirement was unjust punishment for management decisions made in good faith within an organizational culture he hadn't created alone. It was an argument that contained an element of truth that made the case morally more complex than those of Santos and Henderson. Porter had been a product of a system that had valued numbers above all, had been promoted and praised for generating those numbers, and had replicated culture he had found rather than questioning it. But the arbitrator who reviewed his case pointed out something crucial. There was a difference between being a product of a problematic culture and actively protecting agents whose complaints showed a clear, discriminatory pattern. Porter hadn't merely followed the system. He had actively prevented the system from working correctly by dismissing complaints that deserved serious investigation. That active choice, documented in emails and in performance evaluation decisions over years, was where his individual responsibility began, and where the defense of being a product of culture ended. Forced retirement was upheld. The new training module was developed over 8 months in a process Sandra had described as more rigorous than she had expected and more hopeful than she had feared. Representatives from the ACLU, the NAACP, and 3 other civil rights organizations had worked with ICE's training development team to create curriculum that not only explained correct rules, but confronted the gap between written rules and rewarded practice that had allowed Santos's behavior for years. The module included detailed analysis of the Kowalski's incident, with restaurant security footage used as pedagogical tool showing in real time how Santos had targeted Keisha without any legitimate basis. Agents in training sessions were required to identify each moment where Santos had crossed the legal line, to articulate why each crossing was problematic, and to practice alternative responses that would have been legally appropriate. It was training that made it impossible to pretend rules were ambiguous, or that there were multiple reasonable interpretations of what had happened in that restaurant. The external audit of 3 years of investigative contacts from ICE's Arizona division produced a report published completely without redactions, as the settlement had required. The numbers were shocking even for people who had followed the case closely. Of the total 2,847 investigative contacts at private establishments during the 3-year period, 84% had involved people of color. Among contacts that resulted in no irregularity found, which were the overwhelming majority, the racial disparity rose to 91%. Division agents had approached non-white people at private establishments without finding any immigration law violation at a rate that was statistically impossible to explain by any factor other than systematic racial profiling. The report named which agents had the most extreme disparities, which supervisors had supervised those agents, and which geographic locations had been most frequent targets. It was a level of transparency that had never existed before in ECE's Arizona operations, and revealed that the problem was far broader than Santos and Henderson alone. The Kowalski's Employee Defense Fund began operations 2 months after the settlement. In its first 12 months, it received 847 assistance requests from employees in Arizona and neighboring states who had experienced harassment or workplace discrimination. Sandra had anticipated perhaps 100 requests in the first year. The actual volume had been 8 times that estimate, revealing how deep the need was for legal defense resources for workers who couldn't afford lawyers. The fund had managed to provide complete legal assistance for 203 of those cases in the first year, resulting in 67 settlements or favorable decisions that had compensated workers, and in many cases, forced policy changes at specific employers. Sandra had hired an executive director to manage the fund, a young labor rights lawyer named Rebecca Torres who had seen the Kowalski story and contacted Sandra offering to help build something lasting. The fund had become a 5-person staff organization with an operating budget that public and private funding had built well beyond the restaurant's initial compensation. Keisha had graduated from ASU 8 months after the incident as planned, with a business administration degree and academic honors she had worked hard to achieve while balancing work, study, and the additional weight of having become an involuntary public figure during her final year of college. She had continued working at Kowalski's part-time during her final months of school, a deliberate choice to remain in a place that had chosen to defend her dignity rather than distance herself from a space that had been the scene of humiliation. That choice had said something about character that Sandra had deeply admired. After graduation, Keisha had received multiple job offers, including 2 from civil rights organizations that had followed her case and recognized in her someone with a rare combination of personal experience, analytical intelligence, and communicative capacity that made exceptional civil rights advocates. She had accepted a policy advocacy position with the ACLU of Arizona, working specifically on worker rights issues and limits of law enforcement authority on private property. Sandra had been asked in interviews throughout the following months whether she had any regrets about anything she had done that Friday. Her answer had been consistent and immediate. There was nothing to regret about the action she had taken, but there was deep sorrow about the fact that the action had been necessary. In a world where employers routinely defended employees from harassment regardless of its origin, nobody would have needed to know who Sandra Kowalski was or what Kowalski's diner represented. Keisha would have taken the order of 2 men who ate pancakes and left, and nobody beyond her shift colleagues would have known their names. The fact that doing the obvious and decent thing had generated national coverage and a federal lawsuit was evidence not of something extraordinary about Sandra, but of how rarely the obvious and decent thing was done when it involved defending workers of color against institutional authority. That rarity was the real problem, and it was a problem that no settlement or training program alone could completely solve. Kowalski's diner continued operating on the same Camelback Road corner, serving breakfast and lunch as it had for 23 years. The line outside was no longer constant as it had been in the months immediately after the incident, but the restaurant remained consistently busier than before, with a customer base that had grown significantly and included many people who had come the first time, specifically because of the story, but had stayed because the food was good and service was genuinely warm. Sandra had hired 2 additional employees to accommodate the increased volume. One of them, a young Latino man named Daniel Reyes, had said during his interview that he had applied specifically because he had read about what Sandra had done and had wanted to work for an employer he knew would defend employees. Sandra had said he was exactly the type of employee she wanted to hire, and that if every employer in the country adopted a similar policy, the labor market would be a fundamentally more just place for everyone. 3 years after the incident, Keisha and Sandra had become unlikely partners in advocacy work, appearing together at worker rights conferences, speaking with business leaders about creating truly inclusive workplaces, and using the specific and concrete experience of that Friday in Phoenix as a starting point for broader conversations about what protecting worker dignity really meant in practice. They had learned that specific stories with real people and documented consequences were more powerful advocacy tools than abstract statistics, that when Keisha described those minutes in the employee bathroom, or Sandra described the calculation she had made walking toward that booth, audiences understood something about rights and dignity in a way that numbers in a report could never achieve. The Friday that had begun with a young woman being presumed an immigrant at her own job had transformed into the foundation of a partnership that continued creating real change far beyond the walls of the restaurant where it had begun.
Ma'am, I need to see identification right now.
I already told you I have a hearing in 20 minutes.
That's not what I asked. ID.
On what legal basis are you detaining me?
I'm asking for identification.
Then you can speak to court security. I'm going to my chamber. Hey, stop right there.
It was 8:41 a.m. on a Wednesday morning when security cameras at the federal courthouse of the Southern District of Chicago captured something that would paralyze the American judicial system and cost the federal government millions of dollars. A black woman wearing a full black judicial robe, carrying a leather briefcase, was waiting for the elevator in the main lobby when two ICE agents in tactical vests approached and blocked her path. The woman had done nothing to attract attention. She was simply waiting for the elevator, as she did every morning for 11 years, in the same building, on the same floor, on her way to the same courtroom where she presided over federal cases as a judge. The agents didn't greet her respectfully, didn't apologize for the interruption. They simply blocked her path and demanded she prove her right to be in one of the most secure federal buildings in the country. What these agents didn't know, what their arrogance and prejudices made impossible to see, even with all the signs before their eyes, is that the woman they were detaining was the Honorable Judge Diana Reeves, federal judge of the United States District Court appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, with 11 years on the bench and jurisdiction over exactly the type of case ICE depended on federal courts to process. And every second of what happened in the next 27 minutes was captured in crystal clear high-definition video that would destroy careers, trigger a constitutional crisis, and result in one of the most significant federal lawsuits of the year against the very government the agents swore to serve. Before we dive into this completely insane story, tell me something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, hit that subscribe button because stories like this need to be told, need to be shared, need to be remembered. You won't want to miss a single second of what happens next, because the twist that's coming is absolutely epic. Diana Reeves was 54 years old and represented everything the American judicial system claimed to value. She had grown up on Chicago's South Side, daughter of a mail carrier and an elementary school teacher, in a family that treated education as the most sacred thing that existed. She had been the first in her family to complete college, then the first to complete law school, graduating with distinction from Northwestern University School of Law. She had clerked for a federal judge for 2 years, developed a civil law practice for 12 years representing marginalized communities, and built a reputation for intellectual rigor, impartiality, and deep respect for constitutional rights. When she was appointed to federal court at 43, she had been confirmed by the Senate in a bipartisan vote of 87-13, a rare acknowledgement of her exceptional qualifications and unimpeachable character. In 11 years, on the bench, she had presided over hundreds of complex cases involving constitutional law, immigration, civil rights, and federal crimes. She had written opinions cited by appellate courts across the country. She was, by any objective measure, exactly the type of judge the American judicial system needed. Diana had arrived at the courthouse that March morning at 8:37 a.m., 4 minutes before what security cameras would capture as the start of the incident. She had parked in her designated spot in the basement, passed through the security checkpoint with her credentials, as she did every day, and entered the main lobby wearing her full judicial robe that she put on at home to save time in the morning. She carried a leather briefcase containing documents for 3 hearings she had scheduled for that day. Her judicial assistant, Thomas Chen, had arrived before her and was already in her chambers preparing materials. It was completely normal routine for a Wednesday morning at the courthouse. Diana had been checking emails on her phone while waiting for the elevator, mentally reviewing the day's schedule, thinking about complex legal issues that would need her attention. She hadn't noticed the 2 ICE agents in the lobby until they positioned themselves directly in front of her, blocking access to the elevator. The agents, who would later be identified as Ryan Cooper and Daniel Flores, were supposedly in the building to escort a detainee to an immigration hearing scheduled for that morning. It was a procedure that happened regularly at the courthouse. ICE agents brought detainees to federal hearings, and there were established protocols for how this worked, including entry through designated entrances, coordination with courthouse security, and staying in specific areas of the building. Cooper and Flores had deviated from standard protocol in ways that would become clear during later investigation. They were in the wrong corridor, wrong floor, and apparently without adequate supervision or knowledge of where they should be. When they saw Diana waiting for the elevator, wearing a black robe, carrying a briefcase, something in them decided she needed to be interrogated. The lobby security cameras captured everything from an angle that clearly showed not just the confrontation itself, but also the broader context, other courthouse employees passing freely, courthouse security visible in the background, and signage clearly identifying the building as the United States Federal Courthouse. Diana was as obviously in the right place as anyone could be. Cooper moved first, positioning himself directly in front of Diana as she waited for the elevator. He said he needed to see her identification. Diana, whose legal training had prepared her to assess situations quickly, looked at Cooper, then Flores, then at the tactical vests with ice emblazoned on them. She calmly said she was going to her courtroom and asked what the purpose of this questioning was. Cooper said they needed to verify identities of everyone in the building. Diana pointed out she had passed through the security checkpoint with credentials as she did every day for 11 years. Cooper said they had independent authority as federal agents to conduct identity checks. Diana, who knew federal law better than any lawyer in the building, politely but firmly said, ICE agents had no authority to detain judicial employees in a federal courthouse without specific cause. Flores then said something the cameras captured perfectly, and that would be replayed in countless news segments. He said she was in the wrong corridor and that where she was going required special credentials. Diana looked at the elevator clearly marked for floors 3 to 8, where her courtroom was on the 5th floor, then looked back at Flores with an expression mixing disbelief with absolute authority. She said she knew exactly where she was going because she had been going to the same place for 11 years. Other courthouse employees were watching the interaction with growing discomfort. A paralegal named Maria Santos, who had known Diana for 6 years and saw her every morning, was immediately alarmed seeing 2 ICE agents blocking the judge's path. She instinctively grabbed her phone and started recording, capturing an additional angle of the interaction. The courthouse security officer at the main reception, James Walker, noticed the situation and started walking toward the group, though it was impossible to tell from footage whether he had immediately identified who Diana was. The situation was growing more tense with every passing second, and there was something deeply disturbing about watching it. A federal judge in full judicial robe being blocked and interrogated in the very courthouse where she exercised authority over federal cases. The irony was almost impossible to process. Diana maintained extraordinary composure, facing a situation that would have made most people completely lose their temper. She told Cooper and Flores a second time that she was a federal judge of that courthouse, that she was wearing judicial robes, that she was carrying a briefcase with court documents, and that she was waiting for the elevator to go to her own courtroom. Cooper said he needed photo identification, regardless of what she claimed to be. Diana asked specifically what legal authority he was invoking to detain a judicial employee in a federal courthouse. Cooper said it was a matter of national security. Diana responded that national security didn't create unlimited authority for ICE agents to detain people in federal buildings without specific articulable cause, that she knew the law on this very well because she had presided over cases involving exactly these questions. Flores then made the error that would define the entire situation that followed. He told Diana that if she really were a judge, she would have no problem showing identification, and that resisting was making her suspicious. It was the classic logical trap Diana had seen used countless times in cases before her, framing exercise of constitutional rights as evidence of guilt. Diana looked directly at Flores and said something the cameras captured with perfect clarity that would be quoted in every news article about the case. She said she had presided over more than 200 federal immigration cases, that she had signed orders affecting ICE operations, and that the irony of ICE agents trying to intimidate her in her own courthouse wasn't lost on her. She said they could continue down this path if they wanted, but they should understand every second was being recorded on high-definition camera and that she would personally ensure full oversight would be applied to what was happening. Cooper, for the first time showing a sign of uncertainty, asked if she had a courthouse credential she could show. Diana pointed to the identification badge she wore around her neck, clearly visible against her black robe, which read, Judge Diana Reeves, United States District Court, Southern District of Illinois. Cooper examined the badge for a moment, and expression on his face changed slightly. But instead of immediately backing down and apologizing, he said the credential could be forged and he still needed additional verification. James Walker, the courthouse security officer, reached the group at that moment. Walker had worked in the building for 16 years. He knew every judge, every prosecutor, every public defender by name and face. He recognized Diana immediately, and his face showed instant alarm. He addressed her as Judge Reeves and asked if she was okay, what was happening. Diana, maintaining calm but absolutely firm voice, explained these ICE agents had detained her, were refusing to accept her credentials, and were claiming they needed additional verification of her identity despite her being in judicial robes with a visible badge in the building where she worked. Walker turned to Cooper and Flores with an expression of genuine shock. He told them that was Judge Diana Reeves, that she had worked at that courthouse for over a decade, and asked what exactly they thought they were doing. Cooper said they were conducting a security identity verification protocol. Walker said no security protocol authorized outside agents to detain federal judges in their own courthouse without coordination with building security. Cooper tried to maintain authority, claiming that as federal ICE agents they had independent jurisdiction within any federal building. Walker, who had received extensive training on jurisdiction and authority in federal facilities precisely to prevent conflicts exactly like this one, told Cooper he was incorrect. ICE agents inside federal facilities belonging to other agencies operated under interagency courtesy and established protocols, not with unilateral authority to detain employees of that facility. If they needed to verify someone's identity in the federal courthouse, the correct procedure was to coordinate with courthouse security, not block elevators and interrogate passing employees. Walker asked to see Cooper and Flores' credentials and authorization documentation. Cooper provided his ICE identification. Walker asked what specific authorization they had to be in that corridor on that floor, since it didn't correspond to any detainee escort order the security department had received. Cooper became vague about that, mentioning they were navigating the building to find the designated courtroom for their detainee. Diana, who had been silent observing the exchange between Walker and the agents, spoke again. She said she wanted full names and identification numbers from both agents, that she wanted documentation of what specific authorization they had to be in that corridor, and that she wanted a complete incident. Report filed with courthouse security and with the United States Marshal's Office responsible for building security. She said she was going to her chambers now, that she had hearings to preside over, and that these agents should understand what just occurred would not end with her walking to the elevator. Flores tried one last time, saying they were simply doing their job. Diana turned to him with an expression that paralegal Maria Santos, who had watched everything, would later describe as the expression of someone who had spent 11 years hearing bad arguments and knew exactly what they were. Diana said she would understand if they had simply been disoriented in the building and politely asked for directions. But that wasn't what they had done. They had blocked her path, demanded identification, questioned her credentials, and suggested she was suspicious for exercising her rights. That wasn't doing their job. That was harassment of a federal judicial employee in the exercise of her duties. Walker accompanied Diana to the elevator, which arrived immediately, and she stepped in. Doors closed. Cooper and Flores remained in the lobby with Walker, who immediately began the process of documenting the incident and contacting the marshal's office. On the cameras, one could see Flores say something low to Cooper, apparently only now realizing the magnitude of what they had done. Cooper seemed to look at the elevator that had taken Diana away, then at the visible badge on his own identification, and his body language showed someone comprehending they had made a serious mistake. But it was too late. Every second had been recorded. Every word had been captured. And Diana Reeves was not the type of person who let rights violations and misconduct pass without full accountability. As soon as Diana reached her chambers, she made 3 calls before her first hearing. First call was to Chief Marshal James Rodriguez, responsible for security of the entire federal courthouse complex. She described what had happened in factual and precise terms, requested all security video be immediately preserved, and informed him she expected a complete incident report on her desk by end of day. Rodriguez, who had worked with Diana for 8 years and respected her immensely, was visibly disturbed hearing what she described and promised immediate response. Second call was to the Chief Judge of the Southern District, Robert Ashworth, her administrative superior and longtime friend. Ashworth was silent for a moment hearing the account, then said words Diana had needed to hear, that this was completely unacceptable, that the court would respond institutionally, and that he would personally contact the Department of Homeland Security. Third call was to a civil rights attorney Diana had referred others to over the years, but had never personally needed until now. Thomas Chen, her judicial assistant, had overheard the first call and was visibly disturbed. He had worked with Diana for 6 years, knew her temperament and professionalism, and understood the weight of what had happened. Diana noticed his expression and said something Chen would later repeat in multiple interviews. She said she knew he was worried, but that she had presided over cases involving exactly this type of rights violation for years, and that it had come time to deal with one personally. She said her hearings would begin punctually as they did every day, because her responsibilities to parties who had cases before her didn't cease because of what had happened in the lobby. But after the hearings, she would ensure full accountability. She asked Chen if he had everything prepared for the first hearing, an immigration case involving a family that had waited 18 months for her decision. Chen said yes, everything was ready. Diana straightened her robe, gathered her documents, and walked to the courtroom with the same firm and purposeful stride she used every day. What had happened in the lobby was simultaneously completely unacceptable and completely revealing of systemic patterns she had studied from one side and just experienced from the other. Diana's 3 hearings that day proceeded with the precision and professionalism that defined her reputation. Lawyers who regularly practiced in her court noticed something different that day, an even sharper quality of attention than usual, as if she were channeling something into work that normally remained separate. She presided over each case with complete impartiality, asked penetrating questions, and ensured all parties were treated with equal respect and dignity. Nobody in the courtroom knew what had happened in the lobby that morning. When the last hearing concluded at 4:23 p.m., Diana returned to her chambers, where she found the Chief Marshal Rodriguez's complete incident report, copies of security footage from all relevant cameras preserved as she had requested, and a message from Chief Judge Ashworth confirming he had personally contacted the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General's office. She reviewed the footage methodically, making precise notes about timestamps, exact words exchanged, and specific actions by Cooper and Flores that constituted procedural and possibly legal violations. The video was even more devastating than Diana had remembered. Seeing from external perspective what she had lived from inside made the racial profiling even more obvious. Cameras clearly showed multiple other courthouse employees passing through the same corridor in the moments immediately before Cooper and Flores approached Diana. A white man in a suit with a briefcase similar to hers. A white woman carrying a stack of files. 2 white men in casual clothing. None had been approached or questioned. Cooper and Flores had stood in the lobby for approximately 4 minutes before Diana appeared, and cameras showed their eyes following those white employees without any sign of interest. When Diana, wearing a black robe identical to what any federal judge would wear, appeared and positioned herself to wait for the elevator, both agents immediately moved toward her. The sequence was so clear, it was difficult to imagine any explanation beyond racial profiling. The Inspector General's office opened a formal investigation the following day. This investigation had broader scope than simple review of the incident with Diana. Ashworth had provided the Inspector General context about a pattern courthouse security staff had noticed. In the previous 3 months, there had been 4 separate incidents where ICE agents operating in the building had deviated from established protocols, entered unauthorized areas, and in 2 cases had questioned courthouse employees about their reasons for being in the building. In all 4 previous cases, the employees questioned were people of color. None of the white courthouse employees had reported being approached by ICE agents outside the context of escorting detainees. The pattern suggested the incident with Diana wasn't an aberration, but continuation of systematic behavior that had been happening and ignored because previous victims didn't have either Walker's immediate recognition or Diana's position to force institutional response. The story leaked to media within 48 hours, not through Diana, who had determined to follow official channels first, but through multiple courthouse employees who had witnessed the incident and were horrified by what they saw. Once reporters had the initial tip and started asking questions, the full story emerged quickly. Media obtained security footage through public records request that the courthouse, following transparency principles Diana had advocated throughout her career, couldn't legitimately deny. When video aired, impact was immediate and powerful. It showed in crystal clear high definition a federal judge in full judicial robes being blocked in the lobby of her own courthouse by ICE agents who clearly didn't recognize her for what she was. But more revealingly, it showed all the white employees who had passed unquestioned in the minutes before. The visual contrast was irrefutable. The judicial system's reaction was swift and unprecedented in its unanimity. Federal judges typically avoid public comment on contentious matters, preferring to let their opinions speak for themselves. But what happened to Diana touched something fundamental about judicial independence and the principle that federal courthouses must be spaces where law was supreme. Chief Judge Ashworth issued an unusual public statement saying what had occurred was an attack on the institutional integrity of the federal court, and that no agency, regardless of federal authority, could operate within a courthouse with disrespect for its employees and functions. The Judicial Conference of the United States, the body overseeing administration of federal courts nationwide, issued its own statement calling the incident deeply disturbing and calling for immediate review of CIE protocols in federal judicial facilities. 43 federal judges from districts across the country signed an open letter to the Secretary of Homeland Security demanding explanation and reform. Public reaction was even broader. The video was shared tens of millions of times. Comments flooded social media with a mixture of outrage about racial profiling and deep concern about what it meant for judicial independence that executive agents could detain federal judges in the exercise of their duties. Law professors from elite universities wrote opinion pieces about constitutional implications. State and national bar associations issued statements in support of Diana. Senators from both parties demanded hearings. Representatives introduced emergency legislation clarifying protocols for federal operations within judicial facilities. The story had touched on something beyond just another racial profiling case, though it certainly was that. It had touched on a fundamental question about separation of powers, about whether executive branch agents could intimidate judicial branch employees in the exercise of their constitutional duties. ICE's initial response was defensive and revealing. A spokesperson issued a statement saying agents had authority to verify identifications in federal buildings, and that Cooper and Flores had followed standard procedures. But that defense crumbled immediately when confronted with evidence that no standard protocol involved blocking federal judges in judicial robes in their own courthouses, that Cooper and Flores had deviated from their designated detainee escort route, and that they hadn't coordinated with courthouse security as required. Worse for ICE, the Inspector General investigation had found Cooper had 2 previous complaints in his file for unauthorized approaches in federal facilities, and that Flores had completed training on interagency protocols only 6 months prior, making the claim of ignorance particularly difficult to sustain. The standard procedure narrative had become untenable within less than 72 hours after the incident. Investigative reporters discovered Cooper and Flores had been at the courthouse that day with a specific task that required no identity verification of courthouse employees. They were escorting an immigration detainee to a hearing that had been rescheduled the previous week, and they should have gone directly to the designated detention room in the basement, not to the main lobby. They had entered through the wrong entrance, gone up to the wrong floor, and then instead of recognizing their mistake and asking courthouse security for directions, had decided the best use of their time was to question employees they encountered about their reasons for being in the building. The detainee they were supposedly escorting had waited for them in the detention room for 40 minutes before a security officer realized something was wrong and started looking for them. The detainee was eventually transferred by other officers to his hearing, which started 40 minutes late. Precisely because Cooper and Flores were in the wrong lobby, asking questions they had no legal authority to ask. The full irony of the situation became apparent when more information emerged. The immigration hearing, for which Cooper and Flores were supposed to be escorting, their detainee was scheduled before Judge Diana Reeves herself. They had blocked the path of the judge who would preside over their own detainee's case. Had they not deviated from protocol, had they not stopped Diana in the lobby, she would likely have reached the courtroom before them and presided over their detainee's case with the same impartiality and professionalism with which she presided over all others. The situation had generated the extraordinary case of agents preventing the very judge from reaching their own detainee's case. This irony was highlighted by multiple legal commentators as a perfect illustration of how misconduct not only violated rights but undermined the very law enforcement work supposedly being performed. The Inspector General investigation expanded rapidly beyond Cooper and Flores to examine broader systemic issues within ICE. Investigators discovered the department had no adequate training on how to operate within federal judicial facilities belonging to other agencies. ICE's training curriculum focused heavily on enforcement tactics and detention procedures, but dedicated only 4 hours to interagency protocols. And those 4 hours covered multiple types of federal facilities at such superficial level that agents left without clear understanding of limits of their authority in specific contexts like federal courthouses. There was no specific module on how to operate in judicial facilities, on the special status of judicial employees, or on the constitutional doctrine of judicial independence that made courthouses categorically different from other federal facilities. Agents were essentially sent into the field with significant authority, but without the necessary understanding of where that authority ended. Even more concerning was discovery that the pattern of incidents at Chicago's courthouse wasn't isolated. Investigators identified 17 similar incidents in 8 other judicial districts in the past 2 years, where ICE agents had approached or questioned judicial employees inside courthouse facilities without adequate authorization or justification. In 14 of the 17 cases, employees questioned were people of color. In all cases, employees had visible credentials identifying them as courthouse employees. In none of the previous cases had it resulted in serious discipline for involved agents because victims didn't have the platform or position to force comprehensive investigation. Diana Reeves had both. The systematic pattern that had been invisible for 2 years suddenly became impossible to ignore. ICE hadn't just failed to adequately train agents about limits of authority in judicial facilities. It had created a culture where employees of color in federal buildings could be routinely interrogated without cause, while white colleagues passed freely. Cooper and Flores' depositions during investigation were revealing in their inability to provide coherent justification. Cooper was questioned why he had chosen to approach Diana, specifically when multiple other employees had passed through the same corridor. He said she had seemed out of place. Investigators asked what specifically had seemed out of place about a woman wearing full judicial robes in a federal courthouse. Cooper couldn't articulate a specific answer. He tried to say the robe could be anyone's, but investigators pointed out that federal judicial robes are highly specific in design and not available for general purchase. He claimed he hadn't recognized it was a judicial robe, but witnesses, including Walker, confirmed the nature of the garment was completely obvious. Each justification Cooper offered crumbled under basic scrutiny. When investigators showed footage of white employees passing without being approached and asked why he hadn't questioned them, Cooper said they hadn't drawn his attention. Investigators asked what specifically about Diana had drawn his attention in a way those others hadn't. Cooper was silent for a long moment before saying he couldn't explain. Flores' deposition was similarly incriminating. When asked about the phrase he had said to Diana about her being in the wrong corridor, he tried to argue it had been a simple observation about location. But investigators showed footage proving the corridor where Diana was standing was the only corridor leading to the elevators serving her courtroom on the 5th floor, and that she had been exactly where she should be. When confronted with evidence that the statement had been factually incorrect and that he couldn't have known it was incorrect without first verifying where she was going, Flores couldn't explain how he had reached the conclusion she was in the wrong place. The only logical explanation was that he had assumed she didn't belong there without checking whether that assumption had any factual basis. When investigators asked whether he had considered she might be a courthouse employee before approaching her, Flores hesitated before saying he hadn't initially considered that. That admission was devastating. He had approached and detained Diana without first considering the obvious possibility she might work in the building. Cooper and Flores' supervisor, Special Agent in Charge Thomas Bradley, was equally damaging in deposition. Bradley had been notified of the incident within hours, but had chosen to wait to see how the situation developed before taking action. When investigators asked why he hadn't immediately reported the incident involving a federal judge to CE's higher chain of command, Bradley said he had wanted to fully understand the situation first. But emails showed that when Bradley was informed the person detained was a federal judge, his first internal email had been to the union lawyer asking how to protect the agents rather than to supervision about how to properly respond to the incident. The priority had been protecting agents rather than recognizing and addressing a serious violation. Bradley also admitted he had been aware of at least 2 of the 4 previous incidents at Chicago's courthouse, but had treated each as an isolated event, rather than recognizing an emerging pattern requiring intervention. His supervisory failure had allowed problematic behavior to continue until it escalated to the incident with Diana. The federal lawsuit was filed 6 weeks after the incident. The 127-page petition, prepared by Diana's legal team working with a civil rights organization that had joined the case, was a masterpiece of legal argumentation. It named Cooper and Flores personally, Bradley as supervisor who had failed to address a documented pattern, ICE as agency, and the Department of Homeland Security. But most significantly given who Diana was, it also argued violation of the separation of powers doctrine. Executive branch agents had interfered with a judicial branch employee in the exercise of her constitutional duties. This added a completely different layer to the case beyond racial profiling and Fourth Amendment rights violation. It was an argument that Cooper and Flores hadn't just violated Diana's rights as an individual, but had attacked the institution she represented. Damages sought reflected this seriousness: compensation for emotional distress and civil rights violation, but also substantial punitive damages designed to send a message that executive interference with judicial employees carried severe cost. The government's defense tried multiple approaches that one by one failed. First, it argued qualified immunity, but the judge assigned to the case, federal judge Michael Torres, rejected that argument in a scathing decision, noting that a federal judge's right to go about her duties without being detained by agents from another agency in her own courthouse had been clearly established by fundamental constitutional principles. Second, the defense argued Cooper and Flores had acted in good faith based on legitimate security concerns, but video evidence showing they had ignored multiple white employees while specifically targeting Diana made the good faith argument nearly impossible to sustain. Third, the defense tried arguing damages should be minimal because Diana had suffered no physical harm and had been able to conduct her hearings that day. Torres rejected that argument too, noting damage to dignity, institutional authority, and the principle of judicial independence were compensable regardless of absence of physical harm. Each line of defense had been anticipated by Diana's team and countered with solid argumentation and irrefutable evidence. The lawsuit's discovery revealed internal communications, even more damaging to ICE. There was an email chain between supervisors after the incident first became public, where several supervisors discussed how to control the narrative rather than how to ensure misconduct would be addressed. One email suggested emphasizing Cooper and Flores' security credentials. Another suggested trying to limit media access to security footage. A third email, more damaging than any other, showed a senior supervisor saying the real problem was that Diana had overreacted and that if she had simply shown identification, none of this would have happened. That email, which had tried to blame Diana for refusing to accept discriminatory treatment, was displayed at a discovery hearing and became the most cited document in media coverage of the lawsuit. It captured in explicit language the institutional culture that had enabled this and previous incidents. When agents discriminated and victims refused to accept that treatment silently, the institutional response had been to blame the victim rather than the agents. The discovery hearing generated a moment that went viral independently. Diana's lawyer was questioning Bradley about the email blaming Diana, and Bradley tried arguing it had been taken out of context. The lawyer then showed the complete email, then showed footage of the incident, then listed the 17 previous incidents in other districts, then presented stop data showing systematic pattern. After each piece of evidence, the lawyer asked Bradley to explain how that specific item had been taken out of context. Bradley couldn't adequately respond to any of them. When the lawyer reached the 17th incident and asked again about context, Bradley simply fell silent. It was approximately 40 seconds of silence in the hearing room before his lawyer asked for a break. Those 40 seconds of silence, captured in hearing recording, made public, were shared millions of times as symbol of institutional response to irrefutable evidence of systematic discrimination. 11 months after the courthouse lobby incident, The Department of Homeland Security made a settlement offer that reflected both the magnitude of what had happened and the extraordinary pressure the case had generated at multiple simultaneous levels. The direct compensation offer was $4.2 million for Diana, a number her lawyers described as reflecting not only individual rights violation, but broader institutional damage to the federal courthouse and the principle of judicial independence. But as in all cases that truly mattered, money was only the minor part of the equation. The government agreed to permanent termination of Cooper and Flores, with revocation of federal law enforcement certifications nationally, not just in the Northern District of Illinois. Bradley would be forced into early retirement, with loss of benefits related to his documented supervisory negligence. But the systemic reforms Diana had demanded and the Judicial Conference had endorsed were where the settlement found its true weight and meaning. The new mandatory training protocol would be implemented across all 24 ICE field divisions nationwide within 12 months. Every active agent, regardless of years of service or seniority level, would complete a 32-hour program specifically on operations in federal facilities belonging to other agencies. Program would include a dedicated 8-hour module on federal judicial facilities, covering the judicial independence doctrine, constitutional status of judicial employees, specific protocols for ICE operations in courthouses, and legal consequences of unauthorized interference with judicial employees. Training would be developed in collaboration with the Judicial Conference of the United States, ensuring the judicial branch's perspective was incorporated rather than left as afterthought. Agents would have to pass competency tests demonstrating understanding of where ICE authority ended in specific contexts. Failing would result in removal from field work until successful retraining. The settlement established binding interagency protocol for ICE operations in federal judicial facilities. Before any operation in a federal courthouse, ICE agents would be required to notify the chief marshal responsible for that facility with minimum 24 hours advance notice, providing agent names, operation purpose, and planned route within the facility. The chief marshal would have authority to modify planned route or procedures if they conflicted with courthouse operations. Agents who deviated from approved route or who approached courthouse employees without prior coordination with building security would be subject to immediate removal from the facility and expedited discipline. The protocol also required ICE agents in judicial facilities to carry additional identification beyond tactical vests, specifically a contact card with supervisor name and specific case number, authorizing their presence, making it easier for courthouse employees to verify legitimacy of an agent's presence without need for confrontation. The accountability system was perhaps the most significant reformatory component of the settlement. The Department of Homeland Security agreed to create a centralized database, tracking all incidents where ICE agents had approached employees of other federal agencies and federal facilities. Database would be reviewed quarterly by an independent panel, including representatives from the Judicial Conference, the Attorney General's Office, and civil rights organizations. Any agent appearing in the database more than once within a 2-year period would automatically be subjected to comprehensive performance review. Patterns showing racial disparities in who was being approached would result in immediate investigation and potential disciplinary action. The system would make it impossible for supervisors like Bradley to treat incidents as isolated events when they were actually symptoms of a systemic pattern. Data would be made publicly available in annual report, creating transparency that had been completely absent previously. Diana considered the settlement offer with the same analytical depth she brought to every difficult legal question. She and her legal team spent 3 days reviewing every component, testing each proposed reform against what investigation had revealed about systemic failures, identifying gaps where the government could comply with the letter of the settlement while avoiding the spirit. They negotiated 13 modifications before Diana was satisfied with the robustness of the protections. She insisted the interagency protocol include an enforcement mechanism with specific consequences rather than just aspirational guidelines. She demanded the accountability database be administered by an independent entity rather than internally by ICE. She insisted the training program include annual performance assessments rather than one-time training. Recognizing culture change required continuous reinforcement rather than singular intervention. Each modification reflected lessons from her judicial work, where she had seen well-intentioned settlements fail in implementation because they lacked adequate enforcement mechanisms. When the final settlement was announced, Diana convened a press conference in the same lobby where the incident had occurred. It was a deliberate and symbolic choice. She appeared in full judicial robes, the same attire Cooper and Flores had questioned, now framed by national television cameras as symbol of something that couldn't be questioned: the authority of the American federal judiciary. She brought Chief Judge Ashworth and 2 other Chicago federal judges who had been signatories to the open letter to the Secretary of Homeland Security. The collective presence of 4 federal judges in the lobby, where one of them had been detained, sent a powerful message about the judiciary's institutional response to what had happened. Diana spoke for 22 minutes without notes, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades mastering the art of making complex arguments with perfect clarity. She described what had happened in that lobby not as personal affront, though it certainly was that, but as symptom of something more concerning: the assumption that executive authority was unlimited, that agents with tactical vests had the right to question anyone anywhere without need for cause or justification, that black employees in federal spaces were presumptively suspicious while white colleagues received automatic benefit of the doubt. She said the American Constitution was built precisely around rejection of this kind of unchecked authority, that separation of powers was not a bureaucratic technicality, but a fundamental protection against concentration of power that the founders had seen destroy other republics. When the executive detained the judiciary, even inadvertently, even through low-level agents acting from prejudice rather than policy, it was attacking something fundamental about how the American Republic was supposed to function. Diana publicly acknowledged every person who had contributed to the outcome: Walker for immediate recognition and professional response, Thomas Chen for loyalty and support, Marshal Rodriguez for immediate preservation of evidence, Chief Judge Ashworth for strong institutional response, Paralegal Maria Santos for having the presence of mind to film when she saw injustice happening. She also acknowledged employees from the 17 previous incidents in other districts whose experiences had become part of the pattern that made her case winnable. She said she knew her circumstances were exceptional, that most people Cooper and Flores and similar agents had racially profiled didn't have judicial robes or federal chambers to give weight to their complaints. The reforms in the settlement were for those people as much as for any federal judge. There was a question reporters asked that Diana paused lengthily before answering. Someone asked how she had felt in that lobby, what had gone through her mind when Cooper and Flores first blocked her. Diana looked at the space for a moment, then answered with the honesty that had characterized her entire career. She said her first thought had been pure legal training: identify the violation, assess the evidence, determine appropriate response. But she said there was a second thought immediately beneath that one, a thought every black American woman understands intimately, regardless of title or position. The thought that asked how safe she really was, that automatically calculated how the situation could escalate, that knew from experience that a black robe and federal badge were not guaranteed protection against assumptions some people make when they look at you. She said she had been trained by her entire life to be more prepared, more qualified, more excellent than anyone in the field, because she knew standards would be applied to her in ways they wouldn't be applied to others. And yet, at 54 years old, federal judge for 11 years, she had been in that lobby making that familiar calculation of how to navigate a dangerous situation created by someone else's prejudice. No title eradicated the need for that calculation, until systems changed. The settlement terms were implemented under joint supervision of the Judicial Conference of the United States and the Inspector General's Office, a dual oversight mechanism Diana had specifically insisted upon because she wanted to ensure no single agency had unilateral control over verifying its own compliance. Cooper and Flores were terminated within 2 weeks of the settlement signing, their federal law enforcement certifications revoked by the Federal Agent Training and Standards Council, preventing them from working in any federal law enforcement capacity at any agency in any state. Cooper tried to get employment at a state police department, but the case had generated sufficient national coverage that his name was immediately recognizable to any hiring manager who did basic research. He eventually found work in the private sector, completely unrelated to law enforcement. Flores moved to another state, and was reportedly working in logistics, a career completely divorced from the law enforcement work he had compromised through documented misconduct. Their stories became frequent references in ICE training programs about permanent consequences of misconduct in federal judicial facilities. Bradley, forced into early retirement with loss of substantial benefits, tried to contest terms through the union arbitration process. The arbitrator reviewed evidence, including emails, showing Bradley had prioritized protecting agents over addressing misconduct, had ignored a documented pattern of similar incidents, and had tried to blame Diana for exercising her rights. The arbitrator not only upheld the retirement terms, but added a note to Bradley's record documenting that his supervisory negligence had directly contributed to the violation of a federal judicial employee's constitutional rights, a notation that would make any future law enforcement or supervisory position practically impossible to obtain. His 18-year career had ended not with the dignity of an honorable retirement, but with a permanent record of failure that had allowed systematic discrimination to flourish under his supervision. The 32-hour training program launched 6 months after the settlement, developed in partnership with the Judicial Conference as specified. Diana had insisted on personally reviewing the curriculum, and her team had identified 3 areas where the initial draft had been inadequate. Language about judicial independence was too abstract and needed concrete examples. The section on recognizing judicial employees didn't sufficiently cover the diversity of judicial staff. And there were no practical exercises where agents would have to navigate judicial facility scenarios and receive feedback on where they exceeded authority. All 3 deficiencies were corrected before launch. The first training cohort included 847 agents from 7 divisions. Post-training assessments showed significant improvement in understanding of authority limits in judicial facilities, but more importantly, showed a shift in attitudes about how employees of other agencies should be treated, indicating training was reaching not just knowledge, but culture. The centralized incident database became a more powerful accountability tool than anyone had anticipated. In its first 18 months of operation, it recorded 23 incidents where ICE agents had approached employees of other federal agencies in federal facilities. Data analysis revealed 19 of the 23 involved employees of color being approached, an 83% racial disparity in the incident population that reflected systematic pattern rather than random distribution. The independent panel immediately escalated the finding to ICE leadership and the Inspector General's office. 6 of the 23 agents already had previous incidents in the new system, despite it being only 18 months old, indicating persistent behavioral patterns that hadn't been corrected by training alone. 3 were removed from field work and sent for intensive retraining. 2 were opened for full investigation. 1 was fired after investigation revealed deliberate discriminatory behavior that went well beyond training issues. Diana continued on the bench as federal judge, her authority and reputation strengthened by how she had handled the crisis. What had begun as humiliation in the lobby of her own courthouse had transformed into catalyst for reforms, protecting judicial employees across the country. She had been invited to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee on Judicial Independence and Interagency Relations, where her testimony had been described by senators from both parties as among the most substantive and illuminating they had heard in years. She had been keynote speaker at the Judicial Conference's annual conference, where she presented comprehensive analysis of how the settlement had changed ICE operational protocols and what still needed to change. Law schools invited her as visiting professor. She declined all offers, preferring to remain in the work she had chosen, presiding over cases in Chicago's federal courthouse, applying law with the same rigorousness and impartiality that had characterized her entire career. James Walker was promoted to Chief of Security at Chicago's federal courthouse 2 years after the incident, recognition of how he had handled an extremely sensitive situation with exemplary professionalism. In an interview about the promotion, he was asked about that morning. He said he had done only what any person should do, recognized injustice and responded with clarity. But he also said the incident had changed how he thought about security's role in judicial facilities. Security wasn't just about preventing external threats. It was about creating an environment where all employees could exercise their duties without fear of interference, where authority was respected regardless of who carried it, where law was applied equally to everyone, including those supposedly charged with enforcing it. Walker became a frequent reference in security training programs for federal judicial facilities, his name associated with exemplary professional response in an extraordinarily difficult situation. Thomas Chen, Diana's judicial assistant, who had witnessed everything from the adjacent chambers, wrote an academic article about the case that was published in Yale Law School's Law Review. The article analyzed constitutional implications of executive interference with judicial employees, using Diana's case as central case study. It became one of the most cited articles that year in legal literature, downloaded more than 200,000 times, included in constitutional law curricula at dozens of law schools. Chen said in an interview he had written the article precisely to ensure the legal analysis of the case was preserved alongside the factual narrative, that future generations of lawyers and judges would understand not just what happened, but why it mattered, constitutionally. Diana had read every draft version and provided feedback, her legal knowledge transforming an already strong article into something truly exceptional. Maria Santos, the paralegal who had filmed the incident with her phone when her instincts told her something was terribly wrong, became an advocate for documenting problematic encounters in professional spaces. She spoke at Paralegal Association conferences about why documentation was critical protection when witnessing misconduct. She always emphasized she had started filming, not because she knew what would follow, but because something had seemed fundamentally wrong, and she had learned to trust that instinct. Her video, combined with courthouse security footage, had been a crucial piece of evidence making Diana's case irrefutable. Technology hadn't created accountability alone, but it had captured truth in a way no subsequent argument could erase. 10 years after the incident, Diana reflected in an interview that she no longer thought about those 27 minutes in the lobby with the primary anger she had initially felt. She thought about it with a mixture of sadness and determination. Sadness because that type of assumption, that presumption that black people in professional spaces needed to prove they belonged there, continued happening in courthouses and corridors of power across the country, despite decades of reform efforts. Determination because the case had proven accountability was possible, that systems could be changed when people with knowledge and position refused to accept the unacceptable and demanded not just apologies, but real structural change. She had spent 11 years before the incident presiding over cases where she had seen how law could be an instrument of justice when applied with rigor and impartiality. The incident had given her additional perspective that no courtroom could ever have provided, what it meant to be a subject of that law rather than merely its administrator. That perspective had made every subsequent decision more careful, more conscious of the concrete human behind every abstract legal question, more committed to ensuring that the word carved above the entrance of every American federal courthouse, equal justice under law, meant something true for every person who crossed that threshold, regardless of who they were or how they looked.
Tablets, where'd you get them? Those iPads your kids have, where'd they come from? Show me receipts.
Officer, we are having lunch. My grandchildren and I are customers here.
I did not ask if you were customers. I asked where those tablets came from. Kids like that do not have iPads. You know what I mean, and you're being loud. Disruptive.
It was 3:47 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon when security cameras at a McDonald's in Atlanta captured something that would go viral and destroy a police career. A 58-year-old black woman was sitting calmly at a table with her 2 grandchildren, an 8-year-old girl and a 10-year-old boy, eating happy meals and playing with their iPads when a police officer in full uniform approached the table. He didn't politely ask if he could ask a question, didn't professionally introduce himself. He simply stated the children had stolen iPads and demanded the grandmother hand them over immediately. The woman tried to calmly explain these were the children's iPads, Christmas gifts she had purchased. The officer wasn't interested in explanations. He was interested in making a seizure. What this officer didn't know, what his arrogance and racial prejudices prevented him from investigating, is that the woman whose grandchildren he was accusing was Councilwoman Dorothy Hayes, elected member of the Atlanta City Council for 12 years, former public school teacher for 30 years, and one of the most respected voices in the community on law enforcement reform. And every second of what happened in the next 23 minutes was captured on high-definition video that would prove not only that no theft had occurred, but that the officer had racially profiled children based purely on the color of their skin. Before we dive into this completely insane story, tell me something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, hit that subscribe button because stories like this need to be shared so everyone knows this type of injustice still happens, even to innocent children. You won't want to miss a single second of what happens next, because the twist is absolutely epic. Dorothy Hayes was 58 years old and had dedicated her entire life to serving her community. She had grown up in Atlanta's West End. During the 60s and 70s, witnessing civil rights movements, seeing her community fight for equality and dignity. She became a teacher at 22, teaching in public schools in some of Atlanta's most neglected neighborhoods. She believed education was the path to breaking cycles of poverty and injustice. At 46, after 24 years in the classroom, she decided she could have even greater impact at the policy level. She ran for city council and won, becoming a fierce advocate for investment in education, law enforcement reform, and economic justice. In her 12 years on council, she had led initiatives creating community policing programs, establishing a police accountability oversight office, and improving transparency in police stop data. She was exactly the kind of leader communities needed. And on that Saturday afternoon, she was just trying to enjoy time with her grandchildren when her world was interrupted by an officer who saw her as just another black woman who didn't deserve respect. Dorothy had picked up her grandchildren, 8-year-old Destiny and 10-year-old Marcus Jr., from her daughter Lisa's house that morning. Lisa, a nurse who worked weekend shifts at Grady Memorial Hospital, depended on Dorothy for childcare on Saturdays. Dorothy loved this time with her grandchildren. She took them on fun activities, taught them about history and culture, and built memories she hoped they would carry through life. On that specific Saturday, she had taken them to the library in the morning, where they checked out books. Destiny was reading a series about warrior princesses. Marcus Jr. was fascinated by dinosaurs. They spent 2 hours at the library, then Dorothy took them to McDonald's for lunch. It was simple and completely normal routine. The children ordered Happy Meals. Dorothy got a fish sandwich. They found a table near the windows with good light. The children took their iPads from their backpacks and started playing while they ate. Destiny played a coloring game. Marcus Jr. watched educational videos about paleontology. The iPads had been Christmas presents 3 months earlier. Dorothy had purchased them at Best Buy, spending money she had saved specifically for the grandchildren's gifts. She still had the receipts at home, filed with other important records. The iPads had protective cases Dorothy had purchased separately. Destiny's pink with glitter, Marcus Jr.'s blue with dinosaur stickers. She had set up parental controls, downloaded educational apps, and taught the children about internet safety. These were devices she had carefully chosen, legally purchased, and lovingly given to her grandchildren. There was absolutely nothing suspicious or questionable about 2 children using tablets at McDonald's while having lunch with their grandmother. Thousands of children did the same thing every day at thousands of fast food restaurants. But for Officer Brian Matthews, a 34-year-old white officer with 7 years at the Atlanta Police Department, seeing 2 black children with electronics apparently made him immediately suspect crime. Matthews was at McDonald's in full uniform, technically on lunch break during his shift. He had ordered food and was eating at a table across the restaurant when he noticed Dorothy and the children. According to his own later testimony, he saw the children with iPads and something didn't seem right to him. He couldn't articulate what specifically seemed wrong about children using tablets while eating. He just had a feeling the iPads might be stolen. That feeling was apparently strong enough to make him abandon his lunch, cross the restaurant, and confront a family doing absolutely nothing to attract the law enforcement attention. Security cameras captured the exact moment Matthews approached Dorothy's table. The system had 6 cameras covering the dining area from various angles. All were recording in high definition with clear audio. Footage showed Matthews walking directly to Dorothy's table without hesitation. He didn't stop first to observe from farther away. Didn't consult any reports about stolen iPads. Didn't have any specific information suggesting these specific iPads were stolen. He simply decided, based on nothing but seeing black children with electronics, that crime must have occurred. Matthews stopped directly beside the table, looking down at Dorothy and the children with what witnesses later described as obviously hostile and accusatory attitude. Destiny and Marcus Jr., who had been happily focused on their screens, looked up confused when a large uniformed officer suddenly appeared beside them. Dorothy, who was finishing her sandwich, looked at Matthews and politely asked if there was a problem. Matthews' response, captured perfectly on security camera audio, would be quoted in countless news articles and become an example in training programs about what officers should never say. You know what they did. Dorothy, confused, asked what he meant. Matthews pointed at the iPads and said they had been stolen. Not, "May I see those devices for a moment?" or, "There have been reports of stolen iPads in the area." Just flat, direct accusation that 8 and 10-year-old children were thieves. Dorothy, her voice calm but firm, said the iPads belonged to the children, that she had bought them for Christmas. Matthews said he didn't believe her, that kids like these didn't have iPads like those unless they stole them. The phrase, "kids like these," hung in the air. Destiny, a sensitive 8-year-old, started to look scared. Marcus Jr. clutched his iPad closer to himself protectively. Dorothy felt anger rising, but forced herself to remain calm. She knew how situations with police officers could escalate, especially when black people asserted their rights. She kept her voice level and told Matthews he was completely wrong, that there was no theft, that the children had done nothing wrong. Matthews wasn't convinced. He said he needed to see proof of ownership, or he would confiscate the iPads as possible stolen property and potentially detain the children for questioning. Dorothy felt her blood run cold at that threat. This officer was talking about detaining her grandchildren, 8 and 10-year-old children, happily eating at McDonald's, for no reason beyond his own baseless suspicion. She told Matthews very clearly he had no legal authority to confiscate property or detain children without actual evidence of crime. Matthews responded that, as a police officer, he had authority to investigate suspicious activity, and children with expensive electronics constituted suspicious activity. Dorothy, whose voice now carried the edge of authority that came from decades of leadership, asked exactly what was suspicious about children having tablets. Matthews said iPads like those cost hundreds of dollars and were common theft targets. Dorothy pointed out millions of families owned iPads legally, that owning electronics wasn't evidence of crime. Other customers in the McDonald's started noticing the confrontation. Some people stopped eating to watch. A woman pulled out her phone and started filming, instinctively sensing something wrong was happening. Destiny started crying silently, tears running down her face as she clutched her pink glitter iPad to her chest. Marcus Jr., trying to be brave like he thought 10-year-old boys should be, told the officer his grandmother had bought the iPads, that they didn't steal anything. Matthews told Marcus Jr. to be quiet, that adults were talking. The condescending, dismissive tone, directed at a 10-year-old child who was simply telling the truth, made several customers visibly uncomfortable. Dorothy put a comforting hand on Marcus Jr.'s shoulder and told Matthews he was scaring children for no reason, that he needed to leave or provide real legal cause for this interrogation. Matthews said he didn't have to provide anything, that she needed to obey a police officer or there would be consequences. Dorothy made a decision at that moment. She took out her phone and called 911. When the dispatcher answered, Dorothy calmly but firmly reported that an Atlanta police officer was harassing her and her grandchildren at the McDonald's on Peachtree Street, that he had accused children of stealing their own iPads without any evidence, that he was threatening to detain innocent children, and that she wanted a supervisor responding to the location immediately. She provided her full name, including title, Councilwoman Dorothy Hayes. She told the dispatcher this incident would be formally reported, and she wanted an incident number. Matthews looked momentarily surprised Dorothy had called police on a police officer, but he quickly recovered composure and said she was just making things worse for herself. Dorothy responded she wasn't making anything worse, that he was violating her family's rights, and that she would ensure there was complete accountability. While they waited for a supervisor to arrive, Matthews continued insisting the iPads were stolen. He asked Dorothy to surrender the devices so he could check serial numbers against a stolen property database. Dorothy refused, explaining he had no legal right to confiscate private property without a warrant or probable cause of crime. Matthews claimed reasonable suspicion of stolen property was probable cause. Dorothy, who had studied constitutional law extensively during her work on policing reform, politely but firmly disagreed. She explained reasonable suspicion requires specific articulable facts indicating criminal activity, not just an officer's feeling about who should or shouldn't own certain items. Seeing black children with iPads wasn't reasonable suspicion, unless Matthews assumed black children couldn't legitimately own electronics. The implication was clear, and Matthews knew it. He got defensive, claiming this wasn't about race. Dorothy then asked what specifically about her grandchildren or their iPads made him suspect theft. Matthews had no good answer for that. The McDonald's manager, a young Latino man named Carlos Rivera, approached the situation. He had been behind the counter when the confrontation began, but several employees had alerted him that a police officer was confronting customers. Carlos, who had managed that location for 3 years, knew Dorothy. She came there often with her grandchildren. She was always polite, always paid, never caused any kind of problem. He also noticed Matthews had eaten there many times during lunch breaks, and had never confronted any of the white customers he'd seen using iPads, laptops, or other electronics. Carlos politely asked if there was a problem he could help resolve. Matthews said it was police business and didn't concern the manager. Carlos responded that when a police officer confronted customers in his restaurant, it definitely concerned him as manager. He asked if any crime had been reported, if there was any call about theft. Matthews admitted there was no specific call, but that he was investigating suspected stolen property. Carlos asked what evidence there was of theft. Matthews pointed at the iPads. Carlos pointed out many families came to his restaurant with tablets and phones, that he had never seen Matthews question any of them. The woman who was filming, whose name was Jennifer Park, a 29-year-old software developer, continued recording the entire interaction. Her video would capture a slightly different angle than the restaurant's security cameras, showing Matthews' facial expressions and Dorothy and the children's body language more clearly. Jennifer would later tell reporters she started filming because something about how Matthews was treating the family felt fundamentally wrong. She saw parents with children using electronics at that McDonald's all the time. She had never seen an officer question any of them. The fact he chose to specifically confront this black family raised immediate red flags for her. And when she heard Matthews say, "Kids like these," she knew she was witnessing racial profiling in real time. Destiny was still crying, louder now. Marcus Jr. was trying to be strong, but his eyes were red. Dorothy alternated between comforting grandchildren and maintaining firm but respectful confrontation with Matthews. She repeated multiple times the children had done nothing wrong, that the iPads were theirs, that Matthews was traumatizing innocent children for no valid reason. The first Atlanta patrol car responding to Dorothy's call arrived 11 minutes after she had called. The officer who stepped out, Sergeant Michelle Washington, had worked at the department for 14 years. She knew Matthews by sight, but didn't work directly with him. She definitely knew Dorothy Hayes. When you were a police officer in Atlanta, and Councilwoman Hayes was an active council member overseeing law, enforcement, you knew who she was. Washington approached the situation professionally, first asking Matthews what was happening. Matthews explained he had observed children with iPads he suspected were stolen, that the grandmother was refusing to cooperate with his investigation. Washington turned to Dorothy, and her face showed immediate recognition, followed by something like alarm when she realized Matthews apparently didn't know who he was confronting. Washington addressed Dorothy respectfully. "Councilwoman Hayes, can you tell me your version of what happened?" Dorothy calmly explained she was having a peaceful lunch with her grandchildren when Matthews approached and accused the children of having stolen iPads without any evidence or justification. She said Matthews had threatened to confiscate the iPads and detain the children. She had explained the iPads were Christmas gifts she had purchased, but Matthews refused to believe her and continued harassing her family. Washington asked Matthews what specific evidence he had that the iPads were stolen. Matthews said they were expensive models that were frequently stolen. Washington asked if there were any reports of stolen iPads matching these specific devices. Matthews admitted there weren't. Washington asked what specifically about the situation led him to suspect crime. Matthews said it just didn't seem right that children would have iPads like those. Washington, her tone becoming firmer, asked what specifically didn't seem right. Matthews couldn't provide a specific answer that didn't reveal obvious racial assumption. Washington turned to Dorothy and said she was sorry for the experience, that clearly there was no evidence of any wrongdoing and that she and her grandchildren were free to finish their lunch in peace. She then told Matthews she needed to speak with him outside. Her tone made clear it wasn't a request. Matthews followed Washington outside the McDonald's, and while security cameras didn't Capture that conversation, witnesses could see through windows that Washington was obviously reprimanding Matthews. Her body language was that of a supervisor, clearly dissatisfied, confronting a subordinate who had made a serious mistake. Matthews looked defensive initially, then increasingly uncomfortable as Washington continued talking. When they returned inside, Washington approached Dorothy again and said she would be filing a report about the incident, that Matthews would be instructed to leave, and that Dorothy would have an incident number for any follow-up she wanted to do. Dorothy thanked Washington for professional intervention, but made clear she would definitely be doing formal follow-up. Dorothy finished lunch with her grandchildren, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Destiny barely touched the rest of her food. Her expression of happy child transformed into something more withdrawn and frightened. Marcus Jr. stayed quiet, staring at his iPad without really playing anything, occasionally glancing at the door as if expecting Matthews to come back. Dorothy put an arm around each child, pulling them close, saying repeatedly they had done nothing wrong, that the officer had made a mistake, that they were safe. But she saw in the children's eyes that something had changed in that McDonald's. Some innocence had been taken away. Marcus Jr., at just 10 years old, had experienced his first encounter with someone who looked at him and assumed the worst based purely on his appearance. Destiny had seen a uniformed and supposedly authoritative adult make her grandmother feel the need to defend 8 and 10-year-old children for absolutely nothing. These were lessons Dorothy had never wanted to teach her grandchildren so early, but that now had to be addressed honestly. In the car on the way home, Dorothy carefully explained what had happened. She used age-appropriate language but didn't shelter the children from truth. She said sometimes people made assumptions about others based on how they looked rather than who they actually were. She said the officer had made a wrong assumption, that there was nothing wrong with them, and that she would make sure there would be accountability for what happened. Marcus Jr. asked why the police officer had said, "kids like these." Dorothy took a deep breath before answering. She said sometimes people looked at black people, even black children, and immediately thought they were less likely to own good things, or more likely to have done something wrong. She said this was unfair, it was wrong, and it was exactly why she had spent her career working to change it. Marcus Jr. was quiet for a moment, processing that, then asked if the police officer would get in trouble. Dorothy said yes, he absolutely would. As soon as she got home, Dorothy called her daughter Lisa to explain what happened before the children did. Lisa, arriving home from the hospital after a 12-hour shift, heard the entire story with growing outrage. As a nurse who worked with children, she understood the impact of trauma on young minds. As a black mother, she understood exactly what had happened and why. She hugged her children, reaffirmed what Dorothy had said, and then told her mother to do what she needed to do to ensure accountability. Dorothy then spent the next 2 hours doing what she knew how to do best, meticulously documenting everything and activating the networks that decades of public service had built. She wrote a detailed timeline while it was fresh in her memory. She contacted Jennifer Park, the woman who had filmed the incident, who immediately agreed to provide the complete video. She obtained copies of McDonald's security camera footage through Carlos Rivera, who was more than willing to cooperate. And she contacted her personal attorney, a civil rights specialist with 30 years of experience, to discuss courses of action. The following day, Sunday, Dorothy went to the Atlanta Police Department and filed a formal complaint against Matthews. She brought all documentation, timeline, screenshots of her 911 call, Jennifer Park's contact information and name, and a statement from Carlos Rivera, the McDonald's manager. She fully identified herself as Councilwoman Dorothy Hayes and told the reception officer she wanted the complaint documented, a case number, and notification to the chief of police that she would be following up personally. The reception officer, clearly recognizing Dorothy's name and title, ensured she would receive senior supervisory response. Dorothy also filed a separate complaint with the Internal Affairs Division, wanting the process fully documented in multiple channels to ensure it couldn't be quietly swept aside. She had overseen law enforcement enough to know how complaints sometimes disappeared into administrative black holes when they involved only an ordinary citizen versus a police officer. Her position and determination would ensure that didn't happen in this case. Monday morning, before going to a council meeting, Dorothy did something that multiplied pressure on the department exponentially. She published a detailed public statement on her social media accounts, describing what happened, identifying the specific McDonald's, and calling on the Atlanta Police Department for full and transparent accountability. She didn't use inflammatory language. She didn't make excessive emotional appeals. She presented facts clearly and calmly, the same way she had learned over decades of public service. The statement was shared hundreds of thousands of times in the first hours. Combined with Jennifer Park's video that started circulating, simultaneously it created a social media storm that forced the police department and the entire city to respond. The video was particularly powerful. It showed Matthews accusatorially pointing at children, showed Destiny crying, showed Marcus Jr. clutching his iPad protectively, showed Dorothy maintaining dignified composure under pressure. It was impossible to watch and not feel immediate outrage. National media picked up the story within hours. It was a narrative that touched multiple nerves simultaneously. Racial policing, children being targeted, a city council member being disrespected, a grandmother protecting grandchildren. Every major news network wanted the story. Reporters showed up at the Peachtree Street McDonald's, interviewing Carlos Rivera and other employees who had witnessed the incident. They contacted Jennifer Park, whose video had gone viral. They tried to contact Matthews, but his lawyer quickly issued a statement saying he wouldn't be commenting while internal. Investigation was underway. The Atlanta Police Department issued its own statement, vague and defensive as expected, saying they took allegations seriously, that Matthews had been placed on paid administrative leave pending investigation, and that more information would be provided as investigation progressed. The statement satisfied neither journalists nor the public who had seen the video. There was no ambiguity. There were no two sides to this story that made what happened uncertain. Concerning for the department was investigative reporters discovering Matthews had a history of complaints. In his 7 years at the Atlanta Police Department, he had received 11 formal citizen complaints. 7 of those complaints came from black people alleging racial profiling, unjustified approaches, or discriminatory treatment. Of the 11, only 2 had resulted in any discipline, both minor written warnings that didn't affect his career. The others had been filed as unsubstantiated or closed without action after internal investigations many claimed were superficial. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Matthews had a documented history of treating black people differently, and the department had repeatedly ignored it. Dorothy and her grandchildren's case wasn't an aberration. It was continuation of a pattern the department had failed to address. Even more damaging was stop data journalists obtained through public records request. Matthews had made 412 stops in the past 2 years. When analysts examined those stops by race, disparities were shocking. Black people constituted 78% of his stops, despite being only 31% of the population in areas he patrolled. White people were only 9% of his stops, despite being 48% of those same areas. The numbers were impossible to explain as coincidence or result of legitimate crime patterns. They strongly indicated Matthews systematically applied different policing to black versus white people, that he operated with a fundamentally different set of assumptions based on race. When this data was published, it transformed the story from individual incident to evidence of systematic pattern. It wasn't just about Dorothy and her grandchildren. It was about hundreds of other people who had been targeted by Matthews for years. Dorothy was asked to hold a press conference by city council. She appeared composed, professional, wearing a navy blue suit, her glasses framing her face. She brought Lisa and the children, Destiny and Marcus Jr., stood beside their grandmother and mother, silent presence that made everything very real for anyone watching. Dorothy spoke without notes, her voice carrying the weight of decades of advocacy. She described what happened factually, but also spoke about the broader impact. She said as a council member who had worked on policing reform for more than a decade, she understood complexities of law enforcement. She knew there were many excellent officers doing difficult work with integrity, but she also knew systematic racism in policing was a real and documented problem that departments couldn't keep ignoring. This incident wasn't about a bad officer having a bad day. It was about an officer who had demonstrated a pattern of discriminatory behavior that the department had allowed to continue for years. Dorothy also spoke directly to black families across Atlanta and across the country who had experienced similar encounters. She said she knew many families had been racially profiled, that their children had been questioned, that their rights had been violated, but they had no platform or resources to fight back. She said she was using her position to ensure this case resulted in change that would protect those families, not just Councilwoman Hayes with connections and visibility. She promised the disciplinary process would be transparent and complete, that policy changes would be implemented to prevent similar patterns in the future, and that stop data would be made more easily publicly accessible so community could see when racial disparities emerged. The press conference was applauded within and outside the Atlanta community. The internal affairs investigation was formally opened Monday after the incident, and unlike previous investigations involving Matthews that had been conducted superficially, this one was complete and rigorous from the start. There were multiple reasons for this. First, evidence was irrefutable. Security footage from 6 cameras, independent video from Jennifer Park, statements from multiple witnesses including the restaurant manager and other customers, and Sergeant Washington's own report documenting Matthews had been unable to articulate real evidence of crime. Second, the victim was a city council member who had overseen the police department for 12 years and had intimate knowledge of how internal affairs investigations should work versus how they often worked. Third, public pressure was intense and immediate, with national media covering the story and social media demanding accountability. There was no way for the department to quietly file this as it had done with previous complaints against Matthews. Investigators began by reviewing complete footage from all 6 McDonald's security cameras. Unlike incidents where cameras captured only fragments, this had nearly complete coverage of the entire interaction from the moment Matthews entered the restaurant until he left with Washington. Footage showed Matthews sitting at a table across the restaurant for approximately 8 minutes before approaching Dorothy and the children. During that period, cameras captured multiple other customers in the dining area. A white family with children was using tablets at a nearby table. A young white man had a laptop open. 2 older white women were using smartphones. Matthews didn't look once at any of them. His focus was exclusively on Dorothy and her grandchildren from the moment he noticed them. The video evidence demonstrated selective racial profiling so clearly it was hard to imagine how any honest investigation could reach a different conclusion. Witness. Testimonies were consistent and damaging to Matthews. Carlos Rivera, the manager, stated he had seen Matthews at the restaurant many times and had never seen him question any white customer using electronics, even when those customers were using more expensive devices than the children's iPads. Jennifer Park stated she had started filming because Matthews' behavior immediately seemed suspicious to her, that there was something obviously wrong about how he had specifically targeted that family. She said the phrase, "kids like these," had made it clear to her that Matthews was operating with race-based assumptions. 3 other customers who had witnessed the incident gave similar statements, all describing how Matthews had completely ignored white customers while choosing to approach the only black family in the dining section. The weight of multiple independent testimonies, all pointing in the same direction, was overwhelming. Matthews' own testimony was disastrous for his defense. He tried to justify the approach, claiming he had experience recognizing stolen property behavior, and the iPads seemed out of place with the children. When investigators asked him to specify exactly what seemed out of place about children using tablets at McDonald's, he couldn't articulate anything concrete. He mentioned they were new and expensive models. Investigators pointed out the models in question were 2 years old and widely accessible. He claimed the children were being overly protective of the devices. Investigators showed footage revealing the children were simply playing normally until he approached, becoming protective only after he made frightening accusations. Every justification Matthews offered crumbled when confronted with actual evidence. When investigators showed him footage of other customers using electronics without being approached, Matthews couldn't explain why those customers hadn't triggered the same experiential instinct that supposedly motivated his approach to Dorothy and the children. The only obvious difference was race. Investigators also examined the 11 previous complaint files against Matthews. When reviewed with fresh eyes by investigators who had no personal relationship with him, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. 7 of the 11 complaints followed a similar structure. Matthews approaching a black person in a public setting without apparent cause, asking accusatory questions, refusing to accept legitimate explanations, and becoming aggressive when the person questioned his authority. In each previous case, The investigation had found justification for Matthews's actions or simply closed the case without clear conclusion. But when those previous investigations were examined alongside new evidence about how Matthews operated, it became clear previous investigations had been inadequate. They had accepted Matthews' word about his motives without confronting him with evidence that contradicted his. Justifications: they hadn't interviewed independent witnesses comprehensively. They hadn't analyzed stop data for broader context. In short, they had been conducted in a way that protected the officer rather than objectively investigating whether misconduct had occurred. Atlanta Police Chief Marcus Johnson called an emergency meeting with senior leadership 5 days after the incident. Public pressure had been intense since Dorothy's press conference. Protesters had gathered outside the department headquarters. Council members were demanding answers in public sessions. The mayor had stated he expected a complete and transparent disciplinary process. Johnson, who had come to the position promising reform and accountability, understood how he handled this case would define his leadership. There was no way to defend Matthews. Evidence was too clear, history too disturbing, and the victim had too much visibility and credibility to be dismissed. The question wasn't whether Matthews would be disciplined, but how severe discipline would be, and what systemic changes would be implemented to prevent similar patterns. The internal review also revealed failures in Matthews' supervision process. His direct supervisors over the years had access to the same stop data journalists had obtained through public records, but nobody had raised alarm about obvious racial disparities. In performance review meetings, Matthews had been consistently rated as satisfactory or above average, without questions about stop patterns. There was an email where a supervisor had praised Matthews for having good street instincts, a phrase that now looked very different in light of evidence that his instincts were based on racial prejudice rather than actual criminal behavior. Supervisors hadn't necessarily consciously endorsed racism, but they had failed to implement adequate supervision that could have identified and corrected a problematic pattern long before he traumatized 8- and 10-year-old children at McDonald's. Their supervision failure was part of a broader systemic problem. Dorothy, through her lawyer, filed a federal civil lawsuit 2 weeks after the incident. The 94-page petition named Matthews personally, the Atlanta Police Department, the City of Atlanta, and supervisors who had failed to address Matthews' documented pattern of misconduct. The lawsuit sought damages for racial profiling, emotional distress for Dorothy, and specifically for the children, and violation of equal protection rights under the 14th Amendment. But similar to the pattern of other systemic reform cases, money wasn't the primary goal. The lawsuit included a detailed list of policy changes Dorothy demanded. Stop data disaggregated by race made publicly available in real time. Automatic review system triggered when an officer's stop patterns showed statistically significant racial disparities. Mandatory training on implicit bias and unbiased policing conducted by outside experts, and creation of an independent complaint review process where citizens had real representation rather than having complaints investigated exclusively by the same department being accused. Matthews' lawyer's response was to try arguing he had acted in good faith based on legitimate suspicion, but that defense was nearly impossible to maintain in the face of evidence. Footage showed he had ignored multiple white customers using electronics before choosing to approach the only black family. His stop data showed systematic racial disparity over years. His complaint records showed a pattern of specifically accusing black people without adequate evidence. And his own inability during deposition to articulate any specific reason to suspect these particular children that didn't reveal racial assumption made the good faith argument nearly impossible to sustain. The lawsuit was in strong position, and everyone involved knew it. 9 months after the McDonald's incident, the City of Atlanta made a substantial settlement offer. The offer included $2.8 million in compensation for Dorothy and family, with a significant portion specifically designated for Destiny and Marcus Jr., as recognition of the emotional trauma the children had suffered. But as in all truly impactful reform cases, the money was only part of the equation. The offer included permanent termination of Matthews with revocation of his law enforcement certification in Georgia, making it impossible for him to be hired as an officer at any department in the state. His direct supervisors who had failed to address documented patterns of misconduct would be formally reprimanded and required to complete extensive retraining on proper supervision and accountability. But the systemic reforms Dorothy had demanded were the real heart of the settlement, the changes she had fought to implement throughout her counsel career, but had never been able to force through normal political channels with the same urgency this case now created. The new data collection system would be revolutionary in its transparency. Every Atlanta Police Department officer would be required to document every stop they made, person's race, specific reason for approach, duration of interaction, whether search was conducted, whether detention occurred, and outcome. This data wouldn't just be compiled internally, but published on an online portal updated monthly, accessible to any citizen with internet connection. Automatic analysis software would identify when an individual officer's stop patterns diverged significantly from departmental averages, generating an alert for supervision. Any officer whose data showed statistically significant racial disparities for 2 consecutive quarters would automatically be subjected to a comprehensive performance review that included interviews with people they had stopped, analysis of available footage, and assessment by outside experts in unbiased policing. It would no longer be possible for supervisors to ignore problematic patterns by claiming they hadn't seen the data. Mandatory training would be fundamentally different from what the department had previously provided. Instead of online modules officers could complete while doing other tasks, it would be 40-hour in-person training conducted by a combination of civil rights experts, psychologists specializing in implicit bias, and community members who had experienced discriminatory policing. Training would include sessions where officers heard directly from racial profiling victims, not abstract statistics, but personal stories of real impact on real lives. It would include role-playing exercises where officers practiced unbiased approaches in simulated situations, with immediate feedback on when their responses revealed problematic assumptions. It would include a specific component on policing children, recognizing law enforcement interactions, with minors required additional sensitivity and higher standards of justification. And it would include training on recognizing and addressing one's own implicit bias, because research clearly demonstrated unconscious bias could influence behavior even in people who consciously rejected racial prejudice. The independent complaint review process was perhaps the most significant reform. Instead of complaints being investigated exclusively by the department's own internal affairs, the new system would create a civil review board composed of 9 members, 3 appointed by city council, 3 selected by community organizations, and 3 chosen by police department leadership. The board would have real power, authority to subpoena witnesses and evidence, to conduct independent investigations, to recommend discipline including termination, and to publish reports on its findings. Crucially, the police department would be required to publicly respond to the board's recommendations within 30 days, explaining whether it accepted or rejected each recommendation and why. If it rejected a termination recommendation for an officer with clear evidence of misconduct, it would have to publicly explain that decision, creating accountability that simply didn't exist before. Dorothy carefully considered the settlement offer. There was part of her that wanted to go to trial, that wanted to see Matthews sit on the witness stand and be forced to publicly explain his actions, wanted a jury to look at footage of Destiny crying, of Marcus Jr. clutching his iPad protectively, and pronounce a verdict that said unequivocally what happened was wrong and illegal. But her lawyer advised the reforms in the settlement were substantially more impactful than any jury verdict could be. A trial might result in more money, but wouldn't guarantee systemic changes. The settlement created binding accountability mechanisms that would protect families for decades. Moreover, a trial would mean destiny. And Marcus Jr. would potentially be called to testify, or at least that the incident would be extensively relived in media for additional months. The children had already suffered enough. Dorothy consulted Lisa, her daughter, consulted community leaders who had supported the case, consulted civil rights organizations that had monitored the process. The response was consistent: accept the settlement and use resources to create lasting change. When the settlement was publicly announced, Dorothy convened a second press conference. This time, she didn't appear alone with family. She brought a coalition of community organizations, civil rights leaders, and parents of other families who had experienced racial profiling by Atlanta police, but whose complaints had never received adequate attention. Her message was clear. This settlement wasn't a victory just for the Hayes family. It was a starting point for changes that would protect the entire community. She described each reform in detail, explaining why each change mattered and how it would be implemented. She acknowledged that settlements could be announced with fanfare and then quietly ignored, and said that monitoring implementation would be as important as the reforms themselves. She personally promised to oversee implementation in her capacity as councilwoman, presenting quarterly reports to council on progress, and making compliance data publicly available. The press conference was interrupted by an unexpected moment that became the most shared of the entire saga. Marcus Jr., 10 years old, asked to speak. Dorothy looked at her grandson for a moment, then moved the microphone toward him. Marcus Jr.'s voice was clear and steady for a boy his age. He said that when the officer accused him, he wanted to cry, but didn't want to look scared. He said his grandmother had taught him being brave didn't mean not feeling fear. It meant doing the right thing even when you were scared. He said his grandmother was brave, his mother was brave, and he was learning to be brave too. He said he hoped other police officers would learn that black children, just like all children, deserve to be treated with respect. There was silence in the press room for a moment before applause began. The video of Marcus Jr. speaking went viral independently, viewed by millions of people who had never followed the original story. Matthews was officially fired 12 weeks after the incident. His law enforcement certification was revoked by Georgia's Peace Officer Standards and Training Council, preventing him from working as an officer in any jurisdiction in the state. Unlike some cases where terminations were accompanied by colleague solidarity or public union appeals, Matthews' termination was almost universally seen even within the department as the inevitable result of clear evidence and disturbing history. Officers who worked with him daily had seen the footage, had read the stop data, had reviewed the complaint files. Few were willing to publicly defend someone whose misconduct was so clearly documented. The police union made a brief statement saying they would represent Matthews in any appeal, as was their contractual obligation, but even the union's statement sounded pro forma rather than genuinely defensive. Dorothy also used a significant portion of the settlement compensation to establish the Dorothy Hayes Justice Advocacy Fund, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal assistance for low-income families experiencing racial profiling or police misconduct who couldn't afford lawyers. The fund would also finance complaint documentation, helping families create robust records of incidents that would increase chances of successful accountability. She explained at the press conference she had been able to fight back because she had resources and platform most families didn't have. Someone else's daughter, someone else's grandchild, might have experienced exactly the same treatment from Matthews and never received justice simply because there was no councilwoman in the family to apply appropriate pressure. The fund would try to level the playing field, ensuring justice didn't depend on position or connections. Destiny and Marcus Jr. were present at the press conference when the fund was announced. When a reporter asked Destiny what she thought about the fund, the 8-year-old girl said simply, she hoped it would help other children not go through what she had gone through. It was a more powerful answer than any adult in the room could have given. The settlement terms were implemented under Dorothy's direct supervision in her capacity as councilwoman, ensuring promises became reality rather than staying only on paper. Matthews was fired and his certification revoked as specified, and his appeals through the union were all denied when video evidence made any defensible argument impossible to construct. He tried to get work in private security, but his name was permanently associated with accusing 8- and 10-year-old children of theft without any evidence, and employers consistently passed on him after simple online searches. He eventually left Atlanta completely, reportedly moving to another city and finding work entirely outside law enforcement. His supervisors, who had repeatedly dismissed legitimate complaints, were formally reprimanded, required to complete extensive retraining, and never promoted again within the department. Their stories became cautionary examples in leadership training programs about the real cost of negligent supervision. The new Stop Data portal launched 6 months after the settlement. For the first time in department history, any citizen could go online and see detailed data about any officer's stops, including race of people stopped and outcomes of interactions. The immediate transparency revealed patterns that had been hidden for years. Beyond Matthews' data that had already been exposed, the portal revealed 6 other officers with statistically significant racial disparities in their stop patterns. All 6 were immediately subjected to comprehensive performance reviews as required by the new protocol. 2 were found with evidence of systematic bias and sent for intensive retraining, with increased monitoring. 3 had patterns explained by legitimate factors like patrol areas with specific demographics and were cleared after review. 1 was fired after investigation revealed a pattern of misconduct that went well beyond statistical disparities to deliberate and documented discriminatory behavior. The 40-hour training program was implemented in phases over 18 months, with all 1,847 active department officers completing it. Initial resistance from some officers who felt training was implicit criticism of their work was addressed by instructors openly acknowledging most officers were dedicated professionals who wanted to do their jobs correctly. Training wasn't about blame, but about providing tools to recognize and address unconscious bias that could affect anyone. The sessions where racial profiling victims spoke directly were particularly impactful. Dorothy and Lisa brought Destiny and Marcus Jr. to speak at one session, and officers in the room listened in silence as Marcus Jr., now 11 years old, described how he had felt when the officer accused him, how he had wanted to defend his grandmother but hadn't known what to do. Several officers in the room were visibly emotional. A veteran officer approached Dorothy after the session and said the story had changed how he thought about his everyday approaches. The Civil Review Board began operating at full membership 8 months after the settlement. In its first 2 years, it processed 312 formal citizen complaints, a number that itself revealed something significant. 312 complaints had been filed in 18 months, compared to 47 in the same previous period under the old system. The difference wasn't because more misconduct had occurred. It was because citizens now had an accessible and transparent process they felt could actually result in accountability rather than a closed system where complaints disappeared without explanation. Of the 312 complaints, the board found 89 substantiated after full investigation, resulting in discipline ranging from mandatory retraining to termination. The 29% sustaining rate compared to the historical 8% rate under purely internal investigations demonstrated how inadequate the previous system had been. Complaints that would have been automatically dismissed were now being objectively investigated and resulting in real consequences. The Dorothy Hayes Justice Advocacy Fund provided legal assistance for 143 families in its first 3 years who had experienced racial profiling or police misconduct in Atlanta and surrounding areas. Many of these cases would never have been pursued without the fund's support because families simply couldn't afford lawyers. 22 resulted in settlements that compensated families and created policy changes at smaller departments beyond Atlanta. Others resulted in formal complaints that were addressed through the new Civil Review Board. The fund also developed a Knowing Your Rights training program, presented at 47 elementary and middle schools in Atlanta, teaching students about constitutional rights in age-accessible language. Dorothy understood empowering the next generation with knowledge was as important as reforming existing systems. Children who knew their rights would become adults who could effectively exercise them. Dorothy continued serving on city council, her reputation and influence enormously strengthened by how she handled the case. She had been a policing reform advocate for over a decade, but the McDonald's incident had transformed her into a national voice on the subject. She was invited to speak at conferences across the country, testified before congressional committees on policing reform, was consulted by other cities seeking to implement similar transparency and accountability reforms. The Atlanta model, with its public data portal, comprehensive training program, and independent civil review board, began being replicated by departments in 7 other cities within 3 years. Each replication represented more families protected from treatment Destiny and Marcus Jr. had experienced. Dorothy saw this as the most significant legacy of the entire case. Sergeant Michelle Washington, the officer who had responded to Dorothy's call and professionally handled the situation, was promoted to lieutenant 2 years after the incident. In an interview about the promotion, she was asked about the case. She said she had just done her job, had responded to the call, and applied the training she had. But she also said the case had reinforced for her why transparency and accountability mattered, that when officers knew their actions were being monitored and there would be real consequences for misconduct, they were more careful, more professional, more committed to applying the law fairly. She had become a mentor for young officers in the department, emphasizing that effective policing built community trust, and that community trust made the job safer and more effective for everyone. Washington and Dorothy occasionally appeared together at events, their unlikely but genuine friendship serving as example of how bridges could be built between community and law enforcement when both sides acted with integrity. Carlos Rivera, the McDonald's manager who had intervened and provided security footage, was promoted to regional manager overseeing 15 locations. The company recognized him for how he had handled a difficult situation, maintaining professionalism while taking the right side. He occasionally told the story when speaking with new managers about treating customers with respect, regardless of anything. Jennifer Park, the software developer who had filmed the incident and provided crucial video, became an advocate for documenting police encounters, speaking at events about the importance of witnesses taking action when they saw injustice. She always emphasized she had started filming because something had seemed wrong, and trusting that instinct had mattered. Her video had been a crucial piece of the evidence puzzle that made accountability possible. Destiny and Marcus Jr. grew up knowing their experience at that McDonald's had mattered, had led to changes that would protect other children. Dorothy made sure the children understood what had happened in a way that empowered, rather than permanently traumatized them. She took them to city council sessions where they saw reforms debated and implemented. She showed them the online data portal and explained what it meant. She introduced them to other young people in the Knowing Your Rights program at schools. Destiny, at 14, wrote an essay for school about the experience that her teacher submitted for a state writing competition. The essay won first place. She wrote about feeling scared at that McDonald's, about watching her grandmother defend her with calm and dignity, and about learning that justice didn't come automatically, but required people willing to fight for it even when it was difficult and frightening. Reflecting 5 years after the incident, Dorothy said in an interview that Saturday afternoon at McDonald's had been simultaneously one of the most humiliating and most transformative days of her life. Humiliating because she had watched an officer look at her beloved grandchildren and see them as suspects rather than children. Transformative because it had crystallized for her why reform work mattered not in abstract terms, but in concrete human consequences. She had worked for policing reform for years, but had been a reformer from a safe distance, working through politics and process. That day, she had personally experienced what communities she represented experienced regularly. That had made everything more real, more urgent, more personal, and it had produced in her a renewed determination that no political or bureaucratic battle could have generated alone. Sometimes the most painful experiences are those that produce the most lasting change. And when that change happens, when systems are reformed, when children are protected, when communities trust law enforcement more, the suffering that produced it finds purpose beyond any individual and touches the lives of countless others who will never know. Dorothy Hayes' name, but who will live in a world made a little more just because she refused to stay silent at that McDonald's in Atlanta.
Equity is an ongoing path, and information is your greatest armor. We appreciate your viewership and dedication to undeniable truth.